Somewhere in a quiet English house, in the middle years of the 19th century, a lady's maid holds a letter over a candle flame and watches the corner curl black. She has already read it twice. She knows the hand that wrote it, and she knows exactly what it promises, and to whom. She will carry what she has just learned for the rest of her life, and she will never once say it aloud, not because she is especially loyal, though she believes that she is, but because the alternative is a life with no roof, no wages, and no name that any household will ever trust again. She is not unusual. In almost every great house of the Victorian age, there was someone below stairs who knew a secret large enough to end a marriage, a fortune, or a family name outright. Most of them said nothing, ever. This is the story of the ones who did, and the far larger, quieter story of the ones who didn't. You are standing in a corridor that does not officially exist. It runs behind the papered walls of the good rooms, narrow enough that two people must turn sideways to pass, lit by a single tallow candle that gutters whenever a door opens somewhere above. This is the servants' passage, the vein that runs beneath the skin of every fine Victorian house, and if you press your palm flat against the wall on your left, you can feel, faintly, the warmth of the drawing room fire on the other side. You cannot hear the conversation happening in that room, but you know its rhythms anyway, the pauses, the rise of a voice, the particular silence that follows an accusation. You have learned to read a house the way a sailor reads weather. Over the next hour and a half, we are going to move through that world together, slowly, the way smoke moves through a house with too many drafts, not to gawk at scandal for its own sake, but to sit for a while inside a truth that Victorian fiction only ever gestured toward. That domestic servants were not decoration, they were witnesses. They dressed the bodies of the living and often the bodies of the dead. They carried letters before anyone else had read them. They knew which bedroom door did not open at night and which one unexpectedly did, and they were trained from the very first week of service to behave as though they had seen nothing at all. Along the way, there are close to 30 small, lesser-known details folded into what follows, the kind of thing that lives in a court transcript or a housekeeper's ledger rather than a novel, easy to miss unless someone points a lamp at it for a moment. You do not need to hold on to any of them. Let them arrive, and let them settle, and let most of them go. That is what this hour is for. If you enjoy listening to sleepy stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. And if you'd rather just close your eyes completely and let a voice carry you the rest of the way, this story, along with the full library, also lives as an audiobook over on Spotify, and the link is waiting for you in the description or the pinned comment whenever you're ready for it. For now, though, stay here in the passage a moment longer. Somewhere above you, a family is finishing dinner, entirely unaware of how much of their life is already known to the people who will clear their plates. Let the house begin to take its shape around you. Let your shoulders drop from your ears. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight. Every great Victorian house was built twice, once for the family who lived in the front of it with its tall windows and its good light and its rooms named for what happened in them, the morning room, the drawing room, the library, and once again, in secret, for the people who kept it running, a second house folded invisibly inside the first, reached through doors disguised as paneling and staircases hidden behind curtains, so narrow and so steep that they were sometimes called the backbone of the building. You could walk through the grandest hall in England and never suspect that 6 feet away, on the other side of the wall, someone was climbing 40 stairs with a coal scuttle balanced against her hip. Architects of the period had a name for the boundary between these two houses. They called it the green baize door, and in most houses there really was one, a plain door covered in thick woolen felt, usually painted or papered to match the wall so it could barely be found unless you already knew it was there. On one side, Turkish carpet and gilt frames. On the other, bare boards, tallow candles, and the smell of blacking and boiled linen. The felt served a practical purpose, muffling the clatter of a household at work so that family and guests upstairs need never hear it. But it did something else too. It drew a line through the middle of a single roof and declared, without a word, that 2 entirely different kinds of people lived beneath it. You learn the second house before you learn anything else about your position. On your first morning, before you have even been shown where you will sleep, someone walks you through it, quickly, quietly, the way you might be shown the exits of a building that could catch fire. This passage leads to the pantry. This stair is for coals only, never for carrying trays upward past the second floor. This door, here, The one that looks like nothing opens onto the corridor that runs behind the dining room, and you will use it 100 times a day without the family upstairs ever knowing it exists at all. The back stairs were narrower than the front stairs by design, sometimes so narrow that two servants meeting on them had to turn sideways and press themselves to the wall, murmuring an apology neither of them meant particularly deeply, since apologizing to each other was one of the few small courtesies you were permitted to keep. The treads were often bare wood rather than carpeted, which meant you learned very quickly, in your very first week, exactly which step groaned and which one didn't. Information that would matter enormously on any night you needed to move through the house without being heard. And you would need to move through the house without being heard. Fires had to be laid before the family woke, which meant creeping into a bedroom at 5:30 in the morning while its occupant slept on, kneeling at a cold grate, coaxing a flame to life with as little sound as possible, and withdrawing again before anyone stirred. It was considered, genuinely, a mark of skill. A good housemaid could lay and light a dozen fires across a house before the first family member had even opened their eyes, and no one upstairs would ever be able to say precisely how it had happened, only that the room had been cold, and then, some time later, it was warm. This was the first and deepest lesson of service, and it had nothing to do with polishing silver or making a bed with hospital corners. It was this: you were to be present and unseen at the same time. Not absent because the work required your constant presence, but somehow beside the point of the household's attention, a kind of moving furniture. In many houses, if a member of the family was walking down a corridor and a servant was walking the other way, the servant was expected to stop entirely, turn to face the wall, and wait, eyes down, until the family member had passed. Not out of any particular cruelty on either side. It was simply the shape the day was supposed to take. You were not to be looked at while you worked, and in exchange, you were not required to look back. The very newest arrivals to the household, girls sometimes no older than 12, absorbed this whole silent architecture faster than anyone expected of them, largely because the alternative, a scolding, a docked wage, occasionally worse, taught the lesson quickly and did not need repeating twice. An older housemaid training a new girl rarely explained the rule of invisibility in so many words. She simply modelled it, turning to the wall herself the first time a family member approached in a corridor, and trusted the younger girl to notice and to copy exactly as she had once copied someone older than herself. Consider for a moment what that actually asks of a person: to spend 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours of a single day training your body to disappear inside a room it is, at the very same moment, keeping alive. To know a house so completely, every draught, every loose floorboard, every hour its residents rise and dress and quarrel and reconcile, and to be asked in return to behave as though you know almost nothing at all. It is a strange kind of intimacy, built entirely in one direction. The family rarely learned your full name if they could avoid the trouble of it. You, meanwhile, learned theirs completely, along with 100 smaller things they never meant to teach you. Sleep, when it came far from the good rooms. Servants' bedrooms were most often tucked into the attics, under the slope of the roof, where the ceiling was so low in places that a person of even middling height had to duck to reach the window. These rooms were rarely heated. In winter, water left in a basin overnight would sometimes carry a skin of ice by morning, and more than one memoir from the period describes waking to breath fogging faintly in the dark before the first fire of the day has even been lit downstairs. Junior maids frequently shared not just a room, but a bed, 2 or 3 girls to a narrow mattress, which was less a hardship anyone complained about, and more simply how things were arranged, the way a household budgeted its space the same way it budgeted its coal. And yet the attics held a kind of privacy the rest of the house never offered. It was the only place in the second house where the door, however thin, could be closed against everyone. Diaries that survive from servants of the period, and there are only a handful, since so few servants had the time, the paper, or the education to keep one, describe those small rooms with something close to tenderness. A single window, a shared trunk, a candle stub hoarded past its usefulness because darkness, at least, belonged to no one else. The kitchen sat at the very bottom of the house, both literally and in the order of things, half sunk below ground level in many townhouses, lit through high, narrow windows that looked out at ankle height onto the street, so that the first thing a scullery maid often saw each morning was the boots of passers-by. It was the hottest room in the building in summer, and because of the great iron range that burned constantly, often the only genuinely warm room in winter, which meant the kitchen became something the drawing room upstairs never quite managed to be, a place people actually wanted to linger. Not far from the kitchen, in the larger houses, sat the still room, a small, quiet workspace given over to preserves, cordials, and the delicate work of distilling herbs and flowers into remedies and flavourings, a task usually overseen by the housekeeper herself or a trusted senior maid working directly under her instruction. It was, in its own modest way, a room of real expertise, shelves lined with labelled jars representing months of careful, seasonal work, and it operated under lock and key with the same seriousness as the butler's wine cellar, since a well-stocked still room represented a genuine and not inconsiderable store of household wealth, one that, like everything else behind the green baize door, was managed entirely by people the family trusted absolutely and thanked only occasionally. Above the kitchen sat the housekeeper's room, a small office and sitting room combined, and it functioned as something like the quiet capital of the entire second house. It was here that wages were paid out, disputes were settled, and the household's accounts were kept in a hand so careful it might have belonged to a bank clerk. A housekeeper's room usually had its own fire, its own lock, and its own particular silence, the kind that made junior staff lower their voices without being told to. Every corridor, every stair, every hidden door in this second house served the same single purpose in the end. It let the ordinary machinery of a family's life run constantly, invisibly, in the background of their own awareness, the way blood moves through a body without the body ever having to think about it. The family upstairs experienced clean grates and ready meals and pressed linen as something close to ambient fact, the natural state of the world, rather than the product of dozens of specific, exhausting, carefully timed human decisions made by people whose names they frequently didn't bother to learn correctly. It is worth pausing here to ask a small, quiet question, one that will return more than once tonight. What does it do to a person to spend years memorizing a house this completely and never once being asked what they noticed? Some houses took the architecture of invisibility further still. In the largest country estates, entire wings existed that the family themselves rarely entered, servants' halls big enough to seat 30 staff for a meal, laundries the size of small barns, still rooms where preserves and cordials were made, brewing rooms, boot rooms, lamp rooms devoted to nothing but the cleaning and trimming of oil lamps. Each of these spaces had its own hierarchy, its own rhythm, its own small rituals, forming a functioning village tucked entirely inside a single roofline, one that the family who owned the house might never have fully mapped in their own minds. And because this second house was so thoroughly separate, it developed something close to its own culture. Below stairs had its own jokes, its own feuds, its own unspoken rules about who sat where at the long table in the servants' hall, rules every bit as rigid in their way as the ones observed upstairs at a formal dinner. The butler or the housekeeper sat at the head, of course, and the newest scullery maid sat at the very foot, and everyone understood exactly where they belonged in that order without ever having been handed a written rule about it. There was, for a good stretch of the century, an actual tax levied specifically on the keeping of male servants, a duty a household paid to the government for every footman, valet, or manservant it employed, treated by the law almost as though a liveried footman were a luxury commodity not unlike a carriage or a coat of arms. Families sometimes economized deliberately around this tax, employing female staff in roles that might otherwise have gone to men, or reducing the number of male servants kept purely to limit the annual bill, which meant the very visible presence of matched footmen at a great house's front door was not simply a matter of taste. It was a direct, quantifiable, publicly accessible declaration of wealth, one the tax collector himself had already priced and recorded. The architecture, in other words, was never simply about plumbing convenience or fire safety, though it served those purposes too. It was a physical expression of a much larger idea, one the whole century seemed to agree on without ever quite saying it plainly, that a household worked best when its labour was made invisible, and that the people who performed that labour should learn to think of their own invisibility as a kind of professional pride rather than a loss. Many did come to feel exactly that pride. There is a difference, worth holding on to gently, between being made invisible and choosing to become excellent at moving unseen. A well-run second house was, by any honest measure, a genuine feat of coordination, timing, and skill, and the people who ran it, however little credit the front of the house extended to them, generally knew precisely how good they were at their work. But skill and invisibility, lived together for years at a time, begin to blur into something else. A person who has trained their whole body not to be noticed starts to notice everything in return, almost as compensation. Every door left ajar a moment too long. Every letter placed face down instead of face up. Every night a bedroom door that should have stayed shut, quietly, didn't. The house, remember, was built twice, and the second house, the hidden one, the one behind the felt-covered door, had eyes in every wall. Communication between the two houses depended on a system of bells, wired on coiled springs through the walls and along the corridors, each one connected to a numbered board hung in the servants' hall or the butler's pantry. A pull on a cord beside the drawing-room fireplace would set a specific bell trembling on that board, and whichever servant happened to be nearest learned, at a glance, exactly which room required attention. Later in the century, electric versions replaced the mechanical ones in the wealthiest houses, but the underlying principle never changed. The family need never raise their voice, or leave their chair, or even know which servant would answer. They simply pulled a cord, and somewhere, a bell told the second house what was wanted. Uniform reinforced the same idea in a different register. A housemaid typically wore one dress for the morning's dirtier work, plain, dark, practical, and changed into a second, tidier dress and a fresh white apron and cap for the afternoon, once the heaviest cleaning was done and there was some chance of being seen by the family or their visitors. The change was not about comfort. It was about presentability, a visual signal that the labor of the morning had been tidied away along with its evidence, so that by the time the family required anything, the person answering the bell looked, as much as anything else in the room, appropriately unremarkable. Footmen were chosen, quite openly, partly for their appearance, and newspaper advertisements seeking footmen sometimes specified a minimum height, a preference for a particular hair color to match an existing pair, or a general instruction that applicants should present well in livery. A family with the means to employ 2 footmen of matching height and bearing, standing on either side of a doorway in identical dress, was making a very deliberate visual statement about its own standing, and the footmen themselves understood perfectly well that their bodies, quite literally, were part of the household's furniture and decoration in a way their actual names rarely were. The second house also had a way of talking to itself that stretched beyond its own walls entirely. Tradesmen delivering coal, meat, or milk moved between households constantly, and so did their gossip, carried from one kitchen door to the next along with the goods themselves. A cook in one house might learn from the butcher's boy that the family 2 streets over had dismissed their housekeeper rather suddenly, and would trade that information, in turn, for whatever small piece of news her own kitchen could offer back. Servants attending the same church or meeting briefly at the market extended this network further still, so that the second house of any given street was rarely as isolated from its neighbors as the grand houses above it liked to imagine themselves to be. Somewhere above the kitchen now, a bell is ringing on its coiled wire, summoning someone from the second house up into the first. Whoever answers it will climb those narrow stairs, turn sideways to let someone pass in the corridor, and step once again into a room where they are needed and in every way that matters to the people who live there, not quite seen. Let that image rest with you for a moment. It is the shape of an entire century of quiet, careful, watching labor, and it is only the beginning of what this house is holding. The day begins for you somewhere near 5:30 in a darkness that has not yet decided whether it belongs to night or morning. There is no one to wake you gently. A shared alarm, if the household can afford one, or more often simply the older maid in the next bed shaking your shoulder with the flat efficiency of someone who has done this every day for years and expects to do it for years more. You dress quickly, in the cold, by the memory of where your clothes are rather than by any real light, and you are moving down the back stairs before your mind has fully caught up with your body. By the time the family upstairs wakes, hours from now, the entire machinery of the house will already be running smoothly around them, and this is precisely the point. Victorian domestic service was built on an illusion of effortlessness, and that illusion required a staggering amount of very early, very deliberate effort to produce. Grates had to be cleared of yesterday's ash and relaid with fresh coal. Boots left outside bedroom doors overnight had to be collected, cleaned, and returned before their owners noticed they had ever gone missing. Water had to be carried, can by heavy can, up flights of stairs to washstands because indoor plumbing, even where it existed at all, rarely reached every room of a house. It is worth pausing on a fact that tends to surprise people now. By the middle of the Victorian era, domestic service was the single largest occupation for women in the whole of England, employing more people than the textile mills that usually come to mind first when anyone pictures Victorian industry. It was not a small, quaint corner of the economy. It was, quite simply, one of the engines the entire century ran on, and almost every one of those workers was, at some point in their working life, a young unmarried woman living inside someone else's home. That work was organised with a precision that would not look out of place in a modern company chart. At the very top of the second house sat the butler, if the household could afford one, responsible for the wine cellar, the silver, the male staff beneath him, and quietly the household's public face whenever visitors arrived. Beside him in authority, though answering to no one but the mistress herself, sat the housekeeper, who ran the female staff, managed the linen, the stores, and the accounts, and carried on her belt, quite literally, a ring of keys heavy enough to leave a mark on the fabric of her dress by the end of a long day. Below them came a whole ladder of positions, each with its own uniform, its own duties, and its own very precise sense of where it stood relative to everyone else in the household. A lady's maid, who dressed and attended the mistress personally, considered herself well above a housemaid, who cleaned the rooms, who in turn stood above a scullery maid, who scoured pots in water that had usually gone cold twice over by the time it reached her hands. A footman ranked by his height as much as his competence, since matched footmen, tall and identical in build, were considered a mark of real status at the front door. A valet attended the master exactly as the lady's maid attended the mistress, shaving him, dressing him, managing his wardrobe down to the crease of every cravat. This hierarchy was not incidental. It mirrored, almost exactly, the class structure of the family it served, as though the household could not help but reproduce, in miniature, the very system it belonged to. Senior servants ate at the head of the servants' hall table, were addressed with more formality by their juniors, and in some houses were even served their meals by the lower staff, a small precise echo of the very arrangement happening one floor above them at that same hour. A scullery maid did not simply work beneath a housekeeper. She deferred to her in tone, in posture, in the speed with which she moved out of a doorway to let her pass. Seasons shifted the rhythm of the household considerably in ways that added or subtracted whole categories of labour depending on the calendar. Spring brought the great exhausting ritual of spring cleaning, curtains taken down and beaten, carpets rolled and carried outside, every surface in the house scrubbed with a thoroughness the ordinary weekly routine never demanded. Autumn and winter brought the endless, unglamorous business of fires, coal carried and ash cleared many times a day, across a house that might hold 20 or 30 separate grates, each one somebody's specific responsibility. A servant's year, in other words, was never simply a repeating loop of identical days. It carried its own seasons, layered on top of the daily schedule, like weather layered on top of climate. And every single person in that structure had arrived there by way of the same narrow, unforgiving gate, a document that mattered more than almost anything else in a servant's working life. It was called a character, a written reference from a previous employer, and without one, a person seeking a position in service was, for all practical purposes, unemployable. No agency would place them. No respectable household would risk taking them on. A bad character, or worse, no character at all, could end a career before it had properly begun, and everyone below stairs understood this with the kind of clarity that only genuine economic fear can produce. We will return to the character later tonight because it sits at the very centre of everything this story is really about. For now, simply notice the shape of it. A single letter written by the very people a servant worked for held total power over whether that servant would ever work again. There was no appeals process. There was no third party to consult. If a mistress chose to write nothing at all, or to write something quietly damning, a servant's entire future could be decided in the time it took to dip a pen. The working day itself unfolded in a rhythm so tightly scheduled it might have belonged to a factory floor, if a factory floor could also be beautifully upholstered. Breakfast for the family had to be ready at a set hour, which meant the kitchen staff had usually been awake for 2 or 3 hours already. Once the family's meal was cleared, the rooms had to be cleaned while the family was occupied elsewhere, since being seen cleaning was itself considered faintly improper, evidence of labor the household preferred not to witness directly. Luncheon followed the same quiet choreography, then afternoon calls, then the far larger undertaking of dinner, often a meal of many courses requiring hours of preparation for perhaps 40 minutes of actual eating upstairs. In many households, one particular moment of each day briefly and formally crossed the boundary this whole story has spent so long describing. Family prayers, held before breakfast in a great many devout Victorian homes, required the entire household staff to assemble in the hall or the dining room alongside the family, standing quietly at the back while the master of the house, or occasionally a visiting clergyman, read a short passage of scripture and led a prayer for the day ahead. For a few minutes, servant and family occupied the very same room, heads bowed together, and then, as soon as the final Amen had been spoken, the two houses separated again as completely as they had ever been, the family moving to their breakfast table, the staff returning immediately to the kitchen and the corridors that belonged to them alone. A housemaid's day might easily stretch to 16 hours, with perhaps 2 of those hours genuinely her own, and even those were rarely private, spent in a shared attic room or a corner of the servants' hall rather than anywhere truly separate from the household's gaze. Half a day off, once a week if she was fortunate, and perhaps attendance at church on a Sunday morning constituted the entire visible edge of a servant's independent life. Everything else belonged, in practice, if not quite in law, to the house. And yet, within that rigid structure, staff found small pockets of genuine authority and even pleasure. The kitchen, ruled by the cook, was in most houses a domain the family rarely entered at all, which made it, oddly, one of the freer rooms in the entire building. A skilled cook could hold real leverage in a household, since a family that ate badly for very long acquired a reputation for it among their peers, and cooks knew this, and occasionally used it quietly to negotiate better terms than their formal rank would suggest they deserved. Younger staff sometimes described the kitchen, in whatever fragments of memory survived from the period, as the one place in an otherwise rigidly supervised house where something like ordinary, unguarded conversation was genuinely possible, laughter included, provided the cook herself was in a reasonably good humor that particular day. It was not freedom in any real sense, but compared to the watchful quiet expected everywhere else in the house, it could feel, on a good afternoon, remarkably close to it. Footmen, for their part, occupied a strange and sometimes envied position. Chosen partly for appearance, dressed in livery that could be extraordinarily expensive, they were visible to guests in a way most other staff were not, standing at doorways, serving at table, accompanying the family on outings. This visibility cut 2 ways. It gave a footman a certain proximity to the family's public life that other servants never had. It also meant he was watched constantly, every gesture and expression monitored for the kind of poise the household wanted its guests to see reflected back at them. Consider for a moment what it must have meant to hold a precise, unshakable rank within a hierarchy of people who were themselves, collectively, considered to rank beneath almost everyone they served. To be, simultaneously, the housekeeper who commanded 15 junior staff with total authority, and a woman who would curtsy without thinking twice the moment the mistress entered her own sitting room. Status, below stairs, was entirely real and entirely conditional, existing only within a much larger structure that could, at any moment, and for almost any reason, decide it no longer wished to employ you at all. It is worth noting that this same conditional status extended to the very language used to address different ranks of staff. Senior servants, a housekeeper, a butler, a cook of long standing were addressed by their surname alone, without a courtesy title, a convention that sounds, to modern ears, almost affectionate in its familiarity, but functioned at the time as a small, constant reminder of rank, distinguishing them clearly from the family upstairs, who were always addressed with full and careful formality. Junior staff fared even less well in this regard, sometimes renamed altogether by a household that found their given name inconvenient or simply preferred a name already familiar to them from a previous maid who had held the same position, a small, almost casual erasure of individual identity that most servants simply learned to accept along with everything else. It is easy, looking back from a distance of more than a century to flatten all of this into a single image, rows of maids in identical caps, a butler with a silver tray, a household running like a well-oiled machine. The reality, lived from the inside, was far more textured than that. It was a genuine society, with its own gossip, its own romances, its own resentments and loyalties, existing almost entirely out of sight of the very people whose comfort it made possible. Getting into service at all required its own careful process, one that began long before a young woman ever laid a single fire. Registries, essentially early employment agencies specializing in domestic staff, kept ledgers of available positions and available applicants, matching one to the other for a small fee paid usually by the servant rather than the household. In country districts, an older tradition persisted well into the century, the hiring fair, where prospective servants gathered in a market town on an appointed day, sometimes wearing a small token in their hat or coat to signal the kind of position they sought, a piece of wool for a shepherd, a whip for a carter, waiting to be approached and questioned by farmers and householders looking to fill a post before the year turned. Wages varied enormously by position, region, and the wealth of the household, but some rough shape can be sketched. A scullery maid, youngest and lowest in the hierarchy, might earn only a handful of pounds across an entire year, alongside her board and a uniform allowance. A housemaid, somewhat more. A skilled cook, or a lady's maid, considerably more again, sometimes several times a scullery maid's entire annual wage, reflecting years of accumulated skill and trust. A housekeeper or a butler at the very top of the ladder might earn a sum that, combined with free board, tips from visiting guests, and various small perquisites of the position, allowed for real savings across a long career. The difference between a servant who left service with nothing at the end of her working life and one who left with something genuinely her own. Promotion, where it existed, followed a fairly predictable path. A girl might enter as a scullery maid at 13 or 14, move to kitchen maid within a few years as she gained skill and as younger girls arrived to take her place at the bottom, and might, with real talent and considerable luck, eventually become a cook herself, or move sideways into housemaid work and climb toward the position of lady's maid or housekeeper. This ladder gave real, tangible purpose to years of hard labour, and it is part of why so many servants, whatever the difficulties of the work, describe genuine satisfaction in having climbed it successfully, arriving eventually at a position of real authority within the only professional world available to them. Wages were not always the whole of a servant's income either. An older custom, called vails, involved guests leaving small sums of money for the household staff who had attended them during a visit, a tip pressed into a footman's hand on departure or left discreetly for the housekeeper who had overseen a guest's comfortable stay. In grand houses that entertained frequently, vails could add up to a genuinely meaningful supplement to a servant's formal wage, and their gradual decline across the century, as households increasingly discouraged or formally banned the practice in favour of straightforwardly higher fixed wages, actually removed a source of income many staff had come to depend on, a change some servants of the period apparently resented rather more than any historian writing later might have expected. Much of what a mistress was expected to know about running this whole intricate system was, by the middle of the century, available to her in print. Household management manuals, the most famous among them running to well over 1,000 pages of recipes, budgets, and detailed instruction on managing every category of servant a household might employ, sold in enormous numbers to young wives newly responsible for their first establishment. These manuals prescribed, in exacting detail, exactly how many servants a household of a given income ought to keep, precisely what each should be paid, and how a mistress ought to instruct, supervise, and if necessary dismiss her staff, treating the whole delicate, deeply human system this evening has been describing as something that could be reduced, tidily, to a table of figures and a checklist of duties. The servants' hall itself, where staff took their meals together, operated by a code of conduct almost as formal as anything observed upstairs. Seating followed strict seniority, the butler or housekeeper at the head of the table, junior hall boys and scullery maids at the foot, and conversation during meals was expected to remain measured, orderly, free of the kind of gossip that might, if overheard by the wrong person passing through, cause genuine trouble. It was, in its own smaller way, as much a performance of order and propriety as any dinner held one floor above, even though almost no one from that upper floor would ever see it. By the time the family finally rose each morning, dressed, breakfasted, and stepped into rooms that felt, to them, simply and naturally clean and warm and ready, an enormous quantity of human effort had already occurred and already vanished from view. The fire had been laid by someone who had knelt in the cold to do it. The boots had been polished by someone who had carried them down 4 flights of stairs and back up again. And somewhere in that quiet, repetitive, physically demanding rhythm, hour after hour, day after day, year after year, the people performing it were also, whether anyone upstairs considered it or not, watching, listening, and quietly learning everything there was to know about the family they served. That knowledge did not arrive all at once, in some single dramatic discovery. It accumulated the way frost accumulates on a window overnight, one small observation layered over another, so slowly that no single morning felt significant. A raised voice behind a closed door, a letter returned unopened, a visit from a doctor that no one quite explained. By the time evening came and the house finally settled into something like quiet, the second house, the hidden one, understood the first house better than the first house understood itself. And tomorrow, before the light had even properly arrived, it would begin again. Hands that knew too much. There is a particular kind of knowledge that has nothing to do with letters read or conversations overheard, and everything to do with hands. Every morning, and again every evening, a lady's maid stood behind her mistress at a dressing table and touched her in ways that no one else in that woman's life, including, very often, her own husband, ever did. Lacing a corset meant knowing the exact shape of a body beneath its clothes, its changes week to week, month to month. A lady's maid was, in the most literal sense possible, one of the very few people who could tell, sometimes before the woman herself had fully registered it, that something in her body was different than it had been the week before. This was simply the mechanics of Victorian dress. A woman of the middling or upper classes could not, in any practical sense, get herself in and out of her own clothing without help. Layers of undergarments, a corset laced from behind, hooks running the length of a spine that its owner could not see and could barely reach, buttons in rows too fine and too numerous to manage with cold or hurried fingers. Getting dressed was not private. It could not be. It was, by necessity, a shared physical task performed twice a day, every day, for years at a stretch, between two women whose social distance from one another was, in every other context, considered enormous. The intimacy of illness went further still when a household included an elderly relative, a grandmother, or an aging father living out their final years within the family home, rather than in any separate arrangement, as was overwhelmingly the custom of the period. Care for the elderly, in almost every practical sense, fell to household staff rather than to family members directly. A lady's maid or a housemaid assigned specifically to attend an aging relation, managing the daily indignities that advancing frailty brings, dressing, washing, feeding, all performed with the same quiet, practiced discretion applied to every other physically intimate task this evening has described. A servant in this role frequently knew an elderly relative's declining health, confusion, or private fears with a completeness that even devoted grown children, visiting for an hour after dinner rather than living inside the daily reality of it, simply could not match. Think for a moment about what that closeness actually contained. A lady's maid saw her mistress's skin in daylight and candlelight both. She saw bruises that a woman might otherwise have kept hidden beneath careful layers of fabric and explanation. She noticed a missed monthly cycle through the simple, unglamorous evidence of laundry, weeks before any doctor was consulted, sometimes weeks before a husband was told anything at all. She watched a body change shape through the early months of a pregnancy that had not yet been announced to the wider family, let alone to society. In many households, the lady's maid knew a woman was expecting a child before the woman's own mother did. The same closeness existed, mirrored almost exactly, between a gentleman and his valet. A valet shaved his master's face with a blade against his throat each morning, an act of trust so complete it is almost startling to consider plainly. He dressed him, undressed him, laid out his clothes, and in doing so saw everything that clothing was meant to conceal. An unexplained scratch. The smell of a perfume that did not belong to the man's wife. A letter left carelessly in a coat pocket, half read before it was noticed and hurriedly reclaimed. Valets frequently found themselves, almost by accident, disposing of small pieces of evidence, a torn note, a pawnbroker's ticket before anyone else in the household had the chance to see them at all. Servants often carried genuine, practical medical skill of their own, learned through years of hands-on necessity rather than formal training, a working knowledge of which herbs eased a fever, which poultice drew out an infection, how to recognize the early signs of a childhood illness turning dangerous. A housekeeper with decades of service behind her frequently possessed more accumulated practical medical experience than a young physician fresh from his training, simply because she had nursed so many patients of every age through so many long nights, while he had, by comparison, seen each case only briefly and moved on. Families quietly relied on this expertise constantly, even while formally crediting only the doctor's occasional visit with any genuine authority. And it went further than clothing and correspondence. In an age before modern medicine, illness was managed largely at home, which meant servants, and particularly senior female servants, were present for almost every physical crisis a household experienced. A lady's maid or a housekeeper might sit up through the night with a fevered family member, changing linens, administering the doctor's prescribed remedies, present at the bedside in a way that felt, in the moment, less like employment and more like something closer to kinship, even though it would never be named that way by either party once daylight returned. The period surrounding a birth carried its own vocabulary and its own extended ritual, one that placed household staff at the very center of a woman's life for weeks at a stretch. A mother was expected to observe what the era called her confinement, weeks spent largely in her own room recovering, seeing almost no one outside her immediate household, and it was overwhelmingly the household staff, rather than the wider family or social circle, who managed this entire extended period, carrying meals upstairs, changing linens, minding the new infant through its earliest and most uncertain weeks, and absorbing, in the process, an intimate record of a recovery that even a woman's own mother, if she lived at a distance, might never fully witness firsthand. Childbirth, in particular, was almost entirely a domestic female event, attended by a midwife or doctor, certainly, but supported at every turn by the household's own senior staff, who prepared linens, boiled water, comforted, and afterward cleaned a room that had witnessed one of the most private and vulnerable hours of a woman's entire life. A housekeeper who had served a family for 20 years might have been present at the birth of every child in that household, might have held each newborn within minutes of its first breath, and might, at the very same time, have remained in every formal sense an employee whose surname the family barely troubled to remember correctly. Doctors, when they were called at all, visited briefly, sometimes for only a few minutes at a time, and relied heavily on the household staff who had actually been present, hour after hour, to describe a patient's symptoms, appetite, and behavior in the intervening days. A nurse, hired specifically for a serious illness, might live in the sick room itself for weeks, but even in households without the means for a dedicated nurse, it was ordinary domestic staff, a housemaid, a lady's maid, who tracked fevers through the night, administered medicines on schedule, and reported back to the physician on his next brief visit with an intimate, continuous knowledge of the patient's condition that the doctor himself, present for mere minutes a day, could never have gathered on his own. In a very real sense, the household's own staff were often the true, continuous medical observers of a family's health, with the physician functioning more as an occasional consultant relying on their account. Death arrived with the same unglamorous intimacy. When a family member died at home, which was the overwhelming norm throughout the century, it was very often servants who performed the final physical care of the body, washing it, dressing it, laying it out for viewing, tasks considered too practical and too unpleasant for grieving relatives to manage themselves. A housemaid in her early 20s might, within a single decade of service, have washed the body of an elderly master, dressed a stillborn infant for burial, and sat through the night beside a dying mistress whose hand she held because there was, in that particular moment, quite simply no one else in the room to hold it. Nursery staff held a particular category of this intimate knowledge all their own. A nursery maid or a wet nurse, brought in to care for and sometimes to feed a newborn child, was present at one of the most closely guarded moments in any Victorian family's private life, and in households where a child had been conceived outside marriage, or where an infant died very young and the family preferred the loss handled quietly and without wider comment, it was almost always a nursery servant who managed the practical reality of it, Arrangements were sometimes made for such children to be raised elsewhere entirely, fostered out to a family in another town, and the nursery maid who helped arrange the handover, who dressed the infant for the final time before it left the household, frequently carried the only complete account of what had actually happened, an account she was expected never to share with anyone at all. Illness of the mind, as much as illness of the body, moved through households in ways that servants were uniquely positioned to witness and uniquely expected to keep quiet about. When a family member's behavior became, in the language of the period, too disturbed or too dangerous to manage safely at home, arrangements for private confinement, sometimes in an asylum, sometimes with a private carer engaged specifically for the purpose, were made as discreetly as a family's means allowed, and it was very often household staff who packed the trunk, who accompanied the carriage, who answered afterward any polite social inquiry about a relative's whereabouts with a carefully rehearsed and entirely vague explanation involving a change of climate or a visit to relations abroad. Whatever they had actually witnessed in the days before that departure stayed, like so much else in this story, entirely below stairs. It is worth sitting with the strangeness of this arrangement for a moment, because it really was strange, however ordinary it felt to everyone living inside it at the time. The people who were considered, socially, barely present in a household, addressed by their surnames only, seated at a separate table, expected to vanish at the sound of an approaching footstep, were simultaneously trusted with almost every physically intimate moment that household would ever experience. Birth, illness, undress, death. The body, in other words, belonged to the servants in ways the family's public reputation never could. This created a very particular kind of power, quiet and almost entirely unacknowledged, but real all the same. A lady's maid who knew her mistress was expecting a child before the mistress had told her own husband held, for those few private weeks, a piece of knowledge that could reshape an entire family's plans, its finances, its social calendar, depending on when and how it eventually became known. She rarely used that knowledge as leverage. Most servants, overwhelmingly, did not. But the knowledge was there all the same, sitting quietly beside the bed linens she folded and the water jug she refilled, and both women, mistress and maid, understood on some level that it was there. There is a quieter irony folded into the wet nurse's role that deserves a moment of its own. A wet nurse was very often a working mother herself, engaged precisely because she had recently given birth and could produce milk for another woman's child, and taking the position frequently meant weaning her own infant early, or leaving that child in someone else's care entirely in order to feed and comfort a baby that was not hers. She would spend her days offering exactly the kind of tender, physical intimacy a mother offers her own child, to a household that paid her for it and rarely paused to consider what she herself had given up to provide it. Pregnancy among the servants themselves, rather than among the family they served, produced its own particular crisis, one governed by rules considerably harsher than anything applied above stairs. An unmarried housemaid found to be expecting a child was, in the great majority of households, dismissed immediately, without a character, regardless of the circumstances that had led to the pregnancy, which were not always as freely chosen as the household's harsh judgment assumed. Senior female staff, housekeepers and cooks in particular, sometimes worked quietly to help a younger servant in this situation, arranging a discreet departure before her condition became obvious, passing along the address of a distant relative or a charitable institution that might take her in. A small, entirely unofficial act of mercy performed inside a system that offered the girl herself no formal mercy whatsoever. Some relationships built from this closeness became genuinely warm, even lasting decades, outliving marriages, surviving moves between houses, continuing in occasional correspondence long after formal employment had ended. A mistress and her lady's maid might, after 20 years together, understand one another's moods and preferences with a precision closer to old friendship than to any employer relationship on paper. There are surviving letters, tender ones, from mistresses to former maids, thanking them for years of care in language that reads, honestly, like grief for a friend, rather than simple appreciation for good service. Other relationships curdled instead into something closer to quiet resentment, particularly where the physical intimacy of the work was not matched by any corresponding warmth or respect from the family. A lady's maid who spent her days managing another woman's most private moments, only to be spoken to sharply, paid poorly, and dismissed without notice at the first sign of trouble, had every reason to carry a very different feeling about all that closeness than the fond nostalgia some memoirs prefer to remember. Intimacy, forced by circumstance rather than chosen freely, does not automatically produce affection. Sometimes it produces something closer to a long, careful, watchful patience. And it is precisely this combination, forced physical closeness paired with total social distance, that made the servant's silence so remarkable and so necessary in the eyes of every family who depended on it. A stranger cannot betray secrets they were never given. But a lady's maid was given everything, every single day, whether she asked for it or not, simply by doing her job with her hands. There is a particular kind of loneliness folded into this arrangement too, one that rarely makes it into the popular imagination of Victorian service. To know a person's body, their fears, their grief, their most private hours, more completely than almost anyone else in their life, and to remain, at every formal and social level, a stranger to them. To sit beside a deathbed as a trusted and necessary presence, and to be listed in the household accounts the very next week, simply as a wage paid out and a set of duties fulfilled. Perhaps this is worth carrying quietly into the rest of the story. Every secret this house holds tonight arrived first through someone's hands, someone who laced a corset, or folded a shirt, or changed a fevered linen, and who understood, long before any letter was written or any court was involved, exactly what they had come to know and exactly what it would cost them to ever say it out loud. Letters in a Victorian household rarely travelled a straight line from the front door to the person they were addressed to. They passed first through servants' hands, sometimes several pairs of them, before ever reaching a breakfast table or a writing desk. A footman collected the morning post from the postman at the area steps. He carried it inside, sorted it by recipient on a silver tray, and delivered it to whichever room the family happened to be occupying. In grander households, a butler oversaw this process personally, weighing letters, noting the postmark, occasionally remarking quietly and only to the housekeeper that a particular hand had written rather more often that month than usual. None of this required opening an envelope. That is worth saying plainly, because it would have been considered a serious breach and largely was not the norm. But an envelope tells a careful observer a great deal even sealed shut. A servant who handled the post daily for years came to recognize handwriting the way a modern person recognizes a familiar voice on the telephone. They knew which correspondent wrote weekly and which wrote only twice a year. They noticed when letters from one particular hand began arriving more frequently, or when they stopped arriving altogether, sometimes for months, sometimes forever. They noticed foreign postmarks, unfamiliar seals, and letters addressed in a hand that did not match any name the family had ever mentioned at dinner. Outgoing post told its own story. A servant tasked with carrying letters to the post office, often walking some distance to do so, could not help but notice repeated correspondence to the same unfamiliar address, or a sudden flurry of letters sent in careful secrecy, handed over folded rather than sealed properly, with instructions to say nothing about the errand. A housemaid asked to slip a note beneath a door, or a footman asked to deliver a message directly, rather than through the ordinary post, understood without being told exactly what kind of message that likely was. Solicitors' letters, when they arrived at all, carried a weight of their own that any experienced butler learned to recognize instantly, a particular quality of paper, a particular formality of address that marked correspondence of real legal or financial consequence apart from the ordinary run of invitations and social notes. A butler sorting the Morning Post might notice such a letter arrive with unusual frequency across a period of weeks, a clear signal, even without ever knowing the letter's precise contents, that some serious matter, a contested inheritance, an approaching lawsuit, a marriage settlement under negotiation, was quietly unfolding somewhere just behind the family's ordinary, composed public manner. Occasionally, a servant's role in the household's correspondence went beyond simple sorting at the direct and sometimes uncomfortable request of a family member. A suspicious husband might instruct a footman to note quietly whenever a letter arrived in a particular unfamiliar hand, or a mother might ask a nursery maid to mention, discreetly, any correspondence her grown daughter received that seemed to come from an unsuitable suitor. These requests placed a servant in a genuinely difficult position, caught between two competing loyalties within the very same household, and refusing outright was rarely a realistic option, given everything already described tonight about a servant's dependency on the goodwill of the very person making the request. Most simply complied, quietly, and carried the resulting knowledge along with everything else into their general fund of things never to be mentioned again. Consider finally the very last transaction that so often closed a servant's relationship with the family they had served, sometimes for decades. A small gift, a modest sum left in a will, a letter of genuine warmth written on the occasion of retirement, thanking her, by name this time, for years of service that the household's formal records had only ever logged as a wage paid and a set of duties fulfilled. These gestures, where they happened, could not undo the fundamental imbalance this whole evening has described. But they mattered all the same to the people who received them, small, late acknowledgements that the person behind the uniform had been genuinely seen, if only in that single final moment. Beyond correspondence, there was the household's money, and almost nothing in a Victorian home moved without a servant's hands passing over it first. The butler held the keys to the wine cellar and the plate room, and kept a careful tally of what was consumed and what remained, which meant he knew, with far more precision than most family members ever bothered to track themselves, exactly how much a household was drinking and how that figure had crept upward or downward across a season. A sudden increase in consumption, quietly noted in a butler's private book, could say a great deal about a household under strain long before the strain became visible anywhere else. The housekeeper's role went further still. She managed the household accounts in genuine detail: tradesmen's bills, wages, the cost of coal and candles and linen, and she was very often the very first person in the entire house to notice when money had grown tight. A tradesman's bill left unpaid for an unusually long stretch. Instructions to economize on the household's food or coal that arrived suddenly, without explanation, partway through a quarter. A quiet inquiry about which pieces of silver might be sold discreetly through a dealer who would ask no questions. All of this passed across a housekeeper's desk before it ever reached wider family knowledge, if it reached wider family knowledge at all. The butler's pantry itself functioned as something close to a private vault within the second house, holding not just the wine but the family silver, counted, weighed and recorded in a book kept for exactly that purpose, item by item down to the smallest teaspoon. A butler who had served a family for years could often identify at a glance precisely which pieces had been sold quietly, replaced with lesser substitutes, or sent discreetly to a pawnbroker to cover a sudden shortfall, simply because he had counted and polished that same silver so many hundreds of times across so many years that its absence registered instantly, the way a familiar room registers instantly when a single piece of furniture has gone missing from it. It is worth remembering that Victorian society placed enormous weight on the outward appearance of financial security. A family in genuine difficulty went to extraordinary lengths to conceal it, maintaining a full complement of servants, a well-set table, fashionable dress, all while quietly falling further and further behind on what they actually owed. This meant the household staff, uniquely positioned to see both the public performance and the private ledger behind it, often understood a family's true financial state with far more clarity than the family's own social circle, sometimes with more clarity than distant relatives who assumed from the outside that all was perfectly well. A butler managing a wine cellar that was quietly being sold off, bottle by bottle, to cover a gambling debt. A housekeeper watching family jewellery disappear piece by piece to a discreet dealer, replaced sometimes with careful paste replicas that only she, dusting the display case each week, would ever notice closely enough to tell apart. These were not rare, dramatic exceptions. They were a fairly ordinary feature of service in households living, as many Victorian households genuinely did, somewhat beyond their means, and working very hard to make sure no one outside the second house ever found out. A lady's maid held a parallel version of the butler's inventory duty, responsible for a mistress's jewellery, keeping careful account of every piece when it was last worn, where it was stored, and increasingly, as the century wore on, and the fashion for wearing real paste imitations of expensive pieces grew more common among families guarding against theft or quietly managing financial strain, which pieces in the jewellery case were genuine and which were clever, deliberate substitutes. A lady's maid who dressed her mistress for a formal evening, fastening a necklace at her throat, often knew far better than the mistress's own husband whether the stones catching the candlelight that evening were real diamonds or careful glass, a small, private fact she was trusted to know and expected, like everything else, never to mention to anyone at all. Gambling itself deserves particular mention since it produced some of the most consistent financial secrets of the century. A valet who accompanied his master to clubs, or simply managed his correspondence and appointments, often knew the shape of a gambling habit with total clarity, the pattern of wins that never quite covered the pattern of losses, the letters from moneylenders disguised in careful formal language, The sudden sale of a horse or a piece of land that made no sense to anyone outside the household, but made perfect sense to the man who had, quietly, been settling debts on his master's behalf for years. Tradesman's credit told its own quiet financial story, one that servants were positioned to read more clearly than almost anyone else. A butcher, a grocer, a coal merchant would typically extend credit to a respectable household for months at a stretch, settling accounts quarterly rather than requiring payment on the spot. And this arrangement depended entirely on reputation, the tradesman's confidence that the family behind a particular front door would eventually pay what it owed. It was very often the housekeeper or the butler who dealt directly with these tradesmen, who noticed when a normally punctual quarterly settlement began arriving late, or when a family suddenly switched suppliers for no stated reason, a sure sign to anyone paying close attention that the previous tradesman had finally declined to extend further credit at all. When a genuine crisis arrived, a sudden death, an arrest, the arrival of bailiffs sent to seize goods against an unpaid debt, it was frequently household staff who managed the practical business of it while family members were, in the language the household itself preferred, simply unavailable. A butler might answer the door to a bailiff personally, negotiate a brief delay, and quietly begin identifying which items of furniture or silver might be sacrificed with the least visible damage to the household's public appearance, all while the family upstairs remained determinedly out of sight, sometimes literally in another room, unwilling to witness a humiliation their own staff were left to absorb and manage on their behalf. The wider public occasionally caught a narrow glimpse of exactly this kind of household strain, usually through the newspapers, which took a lively interest in what the press of the period liked to call cases of the faithless servant, court reports describing staff accused of theft, of spreading damaging rumors, or of attempting to extort money from a former employer. These reports, brief and often lightly moralizing in tone, rarely explained the desperation or grievance that had actually led to the alleged offense, but they remain, today, among the very few surviving windows through which we can see, however briefly and however unsympathetically framed at the time, an actual named servant's actual specific knowledge of an actual household's private affairs, preserved by accident in the public record because a newspaper editor judged it interesting enough to print. And here, once again, is a small question worth carrying with you as the house grows quieter around us tonight. If the servants of a household frequently understood its true financial condition better than the family's own peers did, what did that knowledge cost them to carry? And what, exactly, stopped them from ever letting it show? The answer, in most cases, was simple, practical loyalty, built less from sentiment than from clear self-interest. A household in genuine financial distress was a household likely to reduce its staff, and a servant who had, even accidentally, contributed to a family's public embarrassment could expect no character reference, no future position, and very possibly immediate dismissal without wages owed. Discretion, in other words, was not merely a moral virtue servants were expected to embody. It was the only rational strategy available to someone whose entire livelihood depended on a family's continued good opinion of them. Some servants, it must be said honestly, did use this financial knowledge to their own quiet advantage, though rarely in the dramatic fashion later fiction would imagine. A butler who knew precisely how much wine had gone missing from the cellar, and by whose hand held a certain leverage over a footman he might otherwise have dismissed for a lesser offence. A housekeeper aware of a family's mounting debts might negotiate, gently but firmly, for a wage increase she knew the family could not easily refuse without risking the appearance, to any outsider who might ask, that something in the household had changed for the worse. Most, however, simply carried the knowledge and said nothing, year after year, the way one might carry a stone in a coat pocket long enough that its weight becomes unremarkable. They watched letters arrive and understood their significance. They watched money disappear and understood where it had gone. They balanced ledgers that told a truer story than any conversation held upstairs at dinner, and then they closed the ledger, locked it in its drawer, and returned to the ordinary business of running a household that to every outside eye appeared to be running perfectly well. It is a peculiar kind of trust, when you consider it plainly, one built not on affection but on necessity, extended by families who had, in truth, very little choice but to extend it. Someone had to hold the keys, someone had to carry the post, someone had to balance the books, and once that someone existed inside a household, they could not help but see over months and years exactly what those keys, letters and books actually contained. The family upstairs could control almost everything about their public image. The one thing they could never fully control was what the second house, quietly and continuously, already knew. Insurance against exactly this kind of financial exposure did exist in a limited way, though it belonged almost entirely to the family rather than to the staff who managed its consequences daily. A household might insure its silver, its jewelry, occasionally the building itself against fire, but there existed no equivalent protection whatsoever for the servant managing a family's slow financial collapse from the inside, no severance, no notice period guaranteed by anything beyond custom and goodwill, nothing to soften the blow when a family finally could no longer afford the staff who had spent years quietly propping up its appearance of solvency. The household's assets were protected. The people protecting them in the most literal financial sense were not. Even the household's smallest, most mundane transactions passed through servants' hands in a way that left them holding a running, accurate picture of a family's genuine spending habits, far more accurate than the family's own occasional selective accounting of itself. A butler paying the wine merchant, a housekeeper settling the butcher's account, a lady's maid handling the modest but constant cash needed for a mistress's personal errands, together held a composite financial portrait more honest than any single ledger the family kept for its own review, since no one piece of that picture had been curated for anyone's comfortable self-image. Night is settling more fully over the house now. Somewhere below, a housekeeper closes a ledger for the evening, locks a drawer, and slips a small ring of keys into the pocket of her apron where it will stay, close against her, until morning comes and the whole quiet accounting begins again. No Victorian employment contract ever contained the word discretion in quite so many letters. There was no clause a servant signed, no formal document that spelled out, in the way a modern agreement might, exactly what could and could not be repeated outside the household. And yet every servant in England understood from the very first day of their very first position that silence was the actual price of the work, unwritten, unspoken, and absolutely non-negotiable all the same. The mechanism that enforced this silence so completely did not rely on law at all. It relied on a single sheet of paper, usually no longer than a paragraph or two, called a character. When a servant left one position and sought another, the new employer expected, as a matter of course, a written reference from the old one, describing the servant's competence, honesty, and, quite specifically, their discretion. Without this document, a servant seeking a respectable position in service was, in the most literal sense, unemployable. Registries that placed domestic staff would not consider an applicant without one. Households would not so much as grant an interview. Consider what this actually placed in the hands of an employer, the power to end a servant's entire career permanently with nothing more than a refusal to write or a single, carefully damning sentence. There was no appeal, no third party to consult, no legal remedy available to a servant who felt a character had been written unfairly. A mistress displeased by a servant's manner or suspicious without proof that they had gossiped could simply decline to provide a reference at all, and that decision alone could end that person's ability to work in service anywhere in the country effectively for the rest of their working life. A servant with no character at all occupied a position that was, in practice, considerably worse than a servant with even a modestly poor one. A poor character at least indicated that some previous employer had been willing to engage with the question of who this person was and how they had performed, and a new employer might occasionally choose to overlook a minor criticism if the position was hard to fill or the wage on offer was modest enough. A servant with no character at all, however, having perhaps left a position too suddenly, or having been dismissed by a family unwilling to write anything whatsoever, rather than commit an honest but damaging account to paper, faced a wall of blank refusals from registries and households alike, since no reputable establishment wished to take the risk of a complete unknown into a household holding, as this whole evening has described, so very much worth protecting. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains almost everything else this story will touch on tonight. It was not primarily loyalty or affection or even fear of the law that kept servants silent about what they saw and heard inside a household. It was a plain, practical, and entirely rational calculation. Speak and risk losing not just this position, but every future position. Say nothing and keep the only thing standing between yourself and a life with no wages, no roof, and, in an era with almost no social safety net for the unemployed poor, potentially very little means of survival at all. Registries themselves reinforce this system with quiet efficiency. Employment agencies that placed domestic servants kept extensive records, and informally, agencies and households shared information about staff considered troublesome, whether that trouble meant genuine dishonesty or simply a reputation for talking too freely about a previous employer's affairs. A servant did not need to have done anything provably wrong to find doors quietly closing. A whisper travelling through the right registry, the right housekeeper's private network of acquaintance, could be every bit as damaging as a formally written bad character. This created, in effect, a private surveillance system with no oversight whatsoever, run entirely by the employing class, about the employed class, with no mechanism by which a servant could correct a false impression or defend a reputation once it had been quietly damaged. A housekeeper moving to a new position might find her new employer had already heard, through some acquaintance of her previous mistress, an account of her character that bore little resemblance to how she actually understood herself. There was, in most cases, simply nothing to be done about it. And so silence became, for the overwhelming majority of servants, not an act of particular virtue, but a condition of survival, practiced with the same daily discipline as any other household task. You learn to answer a direct question about the family with the vaguest truthful answer you could manage. You learn to change the subject smoothly when a friend, over a rare afternoon off, pressed you for details about the grand house you worked in. You learned, most importantly, never to write anything down that could later be read by the wrong eyes, which is part of why so few servant diaries from the period survive at all. The ones that do survive tend to be remarkably careful about naming names. If you're finding your eyes growing heavy, that's all right. This is exactly where they're meant to go. But if you'd rather keep listening with them closed completely, remember this story is also sitting quietly in our audiobook library on Spotify, link down in the description whenever you want it. The doctrine of discretion extended even into how servants were permitted to speak with one another. Households of any real size actively discouraged excessive familiarity between staff members and staff from neighbouring houses, precisely because gossip travelled between servants' halls with remarkable speed, carried by tradesmen, by shared church attendants, by staff who moved between positions and brought their old household stories with them into new ones. A butler overheard discussing his employer's business too freely with a neighbouring household's footman could find himself dismissed for it, regardless of whether anything he'd said was even particularly damaging. Servants developed their own informal, whispered counterweight to this entirely one-sided system, even if it could never fully balance the scales. Before accepting a position, a prospective servant would, whenever possible, make quiet inquiries of her own, asking acquaintances already in service whether they knew anything of a particular household's reputation among its own staff, whether wages were paid promptly, whether the mistress was known to be fair or notoriously difficult, whether previous servants had left on good terms or fled at the first opportunity. This informal network, built entirely from word of mouth passed between kitchens and servants' halls, functioned as something like an early, deeply unofficial version of the reputation checking a job seeker might now do openly, except that it offered no protection whatsoever once a servant had actually accepted a post and moved in, entirely dependent from that point forward on the very household whose reputation she had only been able to investigate from the outside. Consider, too, how differently this whole system might have functioned had servants held any formal collective voice at all, anything resembling the unions or professional associations that workers in other Victorian trades had, by the century's later decades, begun slowly organising for themselves. Domestic service, scattered as it was across countless individual private households, rather than concentrated in factories or mines where organising was at least physically possible, never developed anything comparable. Each servant negotiated her own position, entirely alone, against an employer who held every practical advantage, and the isolation of that arrangement, one worker facing one household with no colleagues beyond her own kitchen to compare notes or draw strength from, is itself a large part of why the system this evening has described proved so durable for so very long. Some families went further, requiring senior staff to sign more formal undertakings, particularly in households where a specific family crisis, an illness, a scandal already narrowly contained, made discretion feel especially urgent. These documents rarely used the dramatic legal language later fiction might imagine. They tended instead towards simple, almost gentle phrasing, an agreement to keep the affairs of the family strictly private in exchange for continued wages and, crucially, the promise of a good character whenever that service eventually ended. The characters themselves developed a kind of coded language over the decades, a set of stock phrases whose real meaning any experienced housekeeper reading a new applicant's reference could decode instantly, even though the words on the page appeared to an outsider perfectly polite. A character describing a servant as honest and hard-working but saying nothing whatsoever about temperament was often understood as a quiet warning about a difficult disposition. A reference that praised competence but pointedly failed to mention discretion at all, when discretion was so routinely and specifically praised in glowing characters, could be read almost as loudly as if it had spelled out a concern directly. Servants themselves came to understand this code too, and dreaded, above almost anything else, the prospect of a character that damned them not through open criticism, but through a few conspicuously absent words of praise. Some mistresses used this ambiguity quite deliberately, offering a character that was, on its surface, entirely fair, while making certain through a private word to a mutual acquaintance or a pointed remark dropped at precisely the right social occasion, that any prospective new employer making genuine inquiries would learn considerably more than the written document itself ever stated. This informal spoken layer of reference, sitting alongside the formal written one, gave employers a second, even less accountable mechanism for controlling a servant's future, one that left no paper trail at all and against which a servant had absolutely no means of defending herself, since she would rarely even learn that such a conversation had taken place. The registries themselves varied considerably in quality and reputation, and an experienced servant learned, much as a modern job seeker might learn to distinguish a reputable agency from a disreputable one, which registries genuinely served their applicants' interests, and which functioned mainly as a revenue stream for their owners, charging fees for placements that rarely materialized or for positions the registry had never seriously vetted at all. Some of the more reputable registries built real, lasting relationships with particular households across decades, becoming in effect trusted gatekeepers whose recommendation carried genuine weight, which meant that a servant standing with a good registry became almost as valuable over time as her standing with any single employer, a second parallel reputation to protect and maintain. Male servants navigated a subtly different version of the very same system. A footman or a valet dismissed without a character faced the same practical wall of closed doors as any housemaid, but the pool of alternative work available to a man, however limited, was somewhat broader than what was realistically available to an unmarried woman of the same class, including various forms of manual labor that would never have been considered a respectable option for a female servant of any standing. This meant the absolute desperation that drove some female servants toward the small number of documented blackmail cases this evening has described was, statistically, somewhat less common among male staff, who retained, even at the very bottom of their own profession's hierarchy, marginally more room to maneuver than the women working alongside them. It is worth noting, too, that this system asked something quite specific and quite psychologically demanding of the people living inside it, not simply to keep secrets, which nearly everyone manages from time to time, but to keep secrets indefinitely, for years, sometimes for an entire working life, about people whose most private and vulnerable moments a servant had personally witnessed. A lady's maid who knew of a mistress's miscarriage, a stillbirth never publicly acknowledged, an affair conducted through careful letters she alone had noticed the pattern of, was expected to carry that knowledge silently not for a season but permanently, long after she had left that household service entirely. Many did carry it permanently, and took considerable quiet pride in doing so. Loyalty of this kind was, in its own way, a genuine skill, and senior servants who were known throughout their circle for absolute discretion found their reputations and therefore their employability considerably enhanced by it. A housekeeper who had served 3 families across 30 years and had never once been connected to a leaked secret was, in the closed world of domestic service, considered something close to invaluable, sought after by families who understood exactly what that unbroken silence had actually required of her. But the system also inevitably produced friction, and occasionally it produced rupture. A servant treated with genuine cruelty, dismissed unjustly, paid unfairly, or denied a character out of spite rather than any real failing, sometimes found the calculation shifting. If discretion brought nothing in return, if the good character was withheld regardless of years of faithful, careful silence, what exactly remained to protect? It is precisely in that narrow, desperate gap between a lifetime of enforced silence and the sudden collapse of any reason left to maintain it that the events of the next part of this story tend to begin. There is a particular fatigue that comes from practicing discretion not for a single difficult week, but as a permanent, unbroken condition of an entire working life, and it rarely announced itself dramatically. It showed instead in small, accumulated habits, a servant who learned to let her face go carefully blank the moment a family argument began within earshot, a housekeeper who trained herself never to react visibly to whatever a letter she was handling might reveal, a valet who developed, almost without noticing, an entire second personality reserved purely for moments when discretion was required. Distinct from whatever quieter, more honest self he allowed himself only in the attic room he shared with no member of the family at all. It is worth remembering finally that this entire system of enforced discretion functioned without any of the modern language we might now use to describe it. No one below stairs would have spoken of confidentiality or of professional ethics or of a duty of care, terms that belong to a much later century's way of thinking about employment. They would simply have said, if pressed to explain it at all, that a good servant kept her own counsel, that some things were not hers to tell, that a house's business stayed inside its own walls. The absence of formal language did nothing to weaken the rule. If anything, its very plainness, unwritten, unnamed, simply understood, made it stronger, since a rule everyone already knows without needing to be told rarely gets questioned at all. For now, though, simply notice how completely this quiet, unwritten system shaped an entire century of domestic life. No statute required it, no court enforced it directly, and yet it held, almost without exception, across hundreds of thousands of households for the better part of 100 years, sustained by nothing more than a single sheet of paper and the very real fear of what a life without it might look like. The house settles further into its evening quiet now. Somewhere above, a family finishes its final conversation of the day, entirely unaware of how carefully and for how long the silence protecting them has actually been maintained. One servant, one character, one unspoken understanding at a time. Most secrets that servants carried simply stayed carried quietly for entire lifetimes, and it is important to say that plainly before this part of the story begins, because what follows describes the exception, not the rule. The overwhelming majority of Victorian domestic staff never blackmailed anyone, never leaked a scandal, never once used what they knew as leverage of any kind. But the exceptions did exist, they were recorded, occasionally in painstaking legal detail, and they reveal something important about exactly how much power a servant's silence genuinely held, precisely because of how seriously the law treated its collapse. English law by the middle of the century recognized what we would now simply call blackmail as a specific and serious criminal offense, most clearly defined as demanding money with menaces, threatening to accuse another person of a crime, or threatening to expose information in order to extort payment. Conviction could carry a sentence of penal servitude, meaning years, sometimes many years, of hard labor, a punishment considerably harsher than most theft convictions of comparable monetary value. The law, in other words, treated the threat to reveal a secret as in some respects a more serious offence than simply stealing the same sum of money outright. Reputation in Victorian England was understood to be worth protecting almost as fiercely as property. The records of London's Central Criminal Court from this period, preserved in remarkable detail and still consultable today, contain a steady, quiet trickle of exactly this kind of case: servants and former servants prosecuted for threatening to reveal a secret unless paid to remain silent. They rarely made national headlines. A family facing a servant's threat had every incentive to resolve the matter as quietly as possible, sometimes paying privately, rather than risk a public trial that would, after all, expose the very secret they were trying to protect. Many blackmail attempts by servants likely never reached a courtroom at all, settled instead in silence on both sides, which means the surviving legal record almost certainly represents only a small fraction of what actually occurred. Picture, for a moment, a composite version of exactly this kind of servant, drawn from the general pattern the surviving trial records describe rather than from any single named case. A footman, dismissed after some minor dispute, without the character reference that would let him find another respectable post, spends several increasingly desperate weeks watching his savings run out. He knows, from years of service, that the family's eldest son has been quietly accumulating gambling debts far beyond what his allowance could ever cover, information the footman gathered simply by managing the young man's clothes and correspondence, never by any deliberate act of spying. He writes a letter, carefully worded, mentioning the debts without quite stating a demand outright, and requesting a small sum described only as compensation for his sudden and, he says, unjust dismissal. The family, rather than pay, involves a solicitor. Within weeks, the footman stands trial, and within a further few weeks, he begins a sentence of several years' penal servitude, a punishment that will follow him for the rest of his working life. This is not any single real case. It is, near enough, dozens of them, repeated with only minor variation across the length of the century. When cases did reach trial, the pattern tended to repeat itself with a certain grim consistency. A servant, often recently dismissed, sometimes without the character reference that would have let them find new employment, wrote or delivered a letter to a former employer, referencing some specific piece of private knowledge, an affair, a debt, a family member's confinement, and requesting a sum of money in exchange for silence. The very specificity of these letters, quoted sometimes at length in surviving court records, offers a rare, unfiltered glimpse into exactly what servants actually knew, since a blackmailer, unlike a discreet servant, had every reason to demonstrate precisely how much they understood. Consider the position of a servant standing at that particular threshold. They have, by this point, already lost the thing that protected everyone else in this story, a good character, and with it, any realistic path back into respectable employment. The calculation that had kept them silent for years, protect the character, protect the future, no longer applies because the future it was meant to protect has already been taken away. What remains, sometimes, is simply the knowledge itself, and a very human, very understandable impulse to make it worth something, even knowing exactly how dangerous that impulse is. It rarely worked in their favor. Families with resources and social standing generally had far greater access to legal help than a dismissed servant did, and the same social structures that had made a servant's word worth so little in ordinary employment disputes worked equally powerfully against them in a courtroom. Juries, drawn overwhelmingly from the property-owning classes, tended to view a servant's threat to expose an employer's private affairs as a particularly grave betrayal of trust, regardless of how that servant had come to be so desperate in the first place. Sentences, when convictions followed, were often severe. Barristers defending a servant accused of blackmail faced an unusually difficult task, since the defense available to them was rarely a denial that the servant knew what they claimed to know. The letters and testimony usually made that part of the case fairly clear, but rather an argument about intent, an attempt to characterize a desperate, poorly worded request for assistance as something short of a genuine criminal threat. These arguments succeeded only rarely. Juries drawn from the property-owning classes, as already noted, tended to identify far more readily with the anxious family in the witness box than with the dismissed servant in the dock, regardless of how sympathetically a defense barrister might frame the circumstances that had led to the letter in the first place. And yet the law's harshness towards servant blackmail reveals, almost by accident, exactly how seriously the Victorian establishment understood the danger these people genuinely posed. You do not criminalize something so specifically and punish it so severely unless you recognize how real the underlying power actually is. The law's fierce protection of upper and middle class reputation against exactly this kind of threat is itself a kind of confession, an acknowledgement that servants really did hold precisely the information capable of destroying a family, and that the entire social order depended on that information staying buried. The scale of a blackmail demand often determined which court a case was heard in at all, a fairly technical point that nonetheless shaped how these stories were recorded and preserved. Smaller demands and lesser accusations generally were frequently handled at the local petty or quarter sessions, heard quickly, recorded briefly, and rarely covered by any newspaper beyond a strictly local one. It was only the larger, more sensational demands, particularly those touching on a family of real social standing, that tended to reach the higher criminal courts, tried in more elaborate proceedings, reported at greater length, and preserved as a result in considerably more detail than the great majority of smaller, more ordinary cases ever were. This means the historical record we do have almost certainly skews toward the most dramatic examples, while the far more common, far smaller attempts at leverage between a servant and a household, a quiet request for slightly better wages backed by an unspoken understanding rather than an explicit threat, left barely any trace behind at all. Some of the most consequential cases in this history did not involve a demand for money at all, but simple, devastating testimony given, sometimes reluctantly, in an entirely different kind of legal proceeding. Divorce cases in particular from the mid-century onward, when English law began permitting divorce through the civil courts rather than requiring an act of parliament, relied heavily on servant testimony to establish grounds such as adultery. A housemaid who had, in the ordinary course of her duties, noticed a bedroom door opening at an unexpected hour, or a lady's maid who had observed a mistress's late-night absences, could find herself called to give evidence that would end a marriage, evidence no one else in that household social circle was positioned to offer at all. These servants were not blackmailers. Many gave evidence with genuine reluctance, summoned by subpoena rather than volunteering information, caught between loyalty to a household that had employed them and a legal obligation they had no real power to refuse. Yet the effect on the family's fortunes was often just as severe as any deliberate act of exposure, and it illustrates the same underlying truth from a different angle entirely. Whether a servant's knowledge emerged through malice, desperation, or simple legal compulsion, the outcome for the family exposed by it could be equally catastrophic, and the family understood this, which is precisely why so much energy went into preventing servants from ever being placed in a position to testify against them in the first place. Knowledge of a family's arrangements for a relative's private confinement, the kind of arrangement described earlier tonight, occasionally surfaced in blackmail cases too, since few secrets carried quite as much social danger as an undisclosed mental illness within a respectable family. A servant who had helped pack a trunk or accompanied a carriage to a private asylum held information a family would go to almost any length to keep contained, and the rare surviving cases touching on this particular kind of threat tend to describe some of the harshest responses of all. Families willing to spend considerably more in legal fees pursuing a servant's prosecution than the servant had ever actually demanded, driven less by the money at stake than by a determination to make an example severe enough to discourage anyone else who might consider a similar threat. Some families, it should be said, responded to a servant's desperate letter not with prosecution but with something closer to quiet mercy, particularly where a long and previously faithful service record made the family reluctant to see a once trusted employee sent to years of hard labor over a single, evidently desperate lapse. A family might simply pay the modest sum requested, quietly, and say nothing further, effectively purchasing not just silence but also a kind of forgiveness that never had to be spoken aloud by either party. These cases, by their very nature, left almost no record at all, since neither side had any reason to want the matter documented anywhere, which means the gentler resolutions to exactly this kind of crisis are very likely undercounted in whatever surviving evidence historians can now examine, hidden behind the same wall of discretion that shaped everything else in this story. There is a particular kind of quiet cruelty visible in how these cases tended to resolve, whichever direction they broke. A servant who blackmailed and was caught faced years of hard labor, a punishment that would follow them for the rest of their life, closing off respectable work permanently, regardless of what desperation had driven them to it in the first place. A servant who testified honestly and reluctantly in a divorce case, fulfilling a legal duty they had never sought, often found themselves just as unemployable afterward, since no family wished to hire someone whose testimony had already helped destroy one household's reputation, regardless of how blamelessly that testimony had been given. In both directions, in other words, the system offered very little genuine protection to the servant caught inside it. Silence protected you only until it didn't. Speech, whether chosen freely or compelled by law, tended to end a career just as thoroughly as blackmail did. It is difficult, looking back, to identify a single path through this particular corner of Victorian domestic life that did not eventually narrow down to a version of the same impossible choice: carry the knowledge forever and hope it never becomes unbearable, or release it in whatever form, and accept that your working life in service, one way or another, has already ended. The gender of the servant involved shaped these cases too, in ways the surviving records make fairly plain. Male servants accused of blackmail tended to be tried and discussed in the language of criminal calculation, a scheming footman or valet coldly exploiting information for personal gain. Female servants brought before the same courts on similar charges were far more likely to be discussed in the language of moral corruption. A housemaid whose threat to reveal an affair was treated not merely as extortion, but as a particularly unfeminine, particularly shocking betrayal of the domestic trust a woman was supposed to embody by very nature of her sex. The underlying offence was identical, the public and legal framing of it, and very often the severity of the social condemnation that followed a conviction, was not. It is worth remembering, too, that not every servant who found themselves standing at this particular threshold chose to cross it. Plenty of dismissed servants, equally desperate, equally aware of exactly what they knew and exactly what it might be worth, simply did not write the letter, did not make the threat, and instead absorbed the full cost of an unjust dismissal quietly, seeking whatever lesser work they could find and never once trading on the knowledge they carried. Their restraint left no trial record, no letter preserved in an archive, nothing at all for history to examine directly. It is precisely because their choice produced no drama that it has been so thoroughly, so completely forgotten, even though it was, by any reasonable measure, the far more common response. A smaller number of cases, rarer still, involved servants who used their knowledge not for money but for something quieter, protection from an unjust dismissal, or simply better treatment than their formal position would otherwise have earned them. A housekeeper who let a family understand, without ever stating it directly, that she was fully aware of certain financial irregularities might find her wages increased, her position secured, her opinions given slightly more weight at moments when a lesser-informed servant's opinion would have counted for nothing at all. This was blackmail, in only the loosest, gentlest sense of the word, an unspoken understanding rather than an explicit threat, and it likely occurred far more often than any surviving record could ever fully capture, precisely because it required no letter, no court, no confrontation of any kind. What emerges from all of this, taken together, is not really a story about villainy on either side, servants scheming against the families who employed them, or families cruelly exploiting the desperate loyalty of the people who served them, although both certainly happened. It is a story about a system built almost entirely around one-directional trust, extended downward with total confidence and almost no accountability, and about what happens in the rare cases when that system finally cracks to the people who were never given any real power within it to begin with. The house, this particular night, holds no such crisis. The letters here have all been read and quietly returned to their places. The ledgers balance, more or less, the way ledgers in most households usually did. But somewhere, in some other house very much like this one, at almost any given moment across the length of the 19th century, exactly this kind of quiet unravelling was taking place. One dismissed servant, one desperate letter, one family's carefully maintained silence finally, briefly, coming apart. It would be easy, having spent this much of the evening inside the mechanics of secrecy, to picture the servants of a Victorian household as something close to a quiet intelligence network, calmly gathering information, weighing its value, deciding what to do with what they knew. That picture, while not entirely wrong, misses almost everything that actually mattered about these people's lives, which were, for the very large majority, defined far less by the secrets they held than by the sheer grinding vulnerability of their position within a household that could end their livelihood on a single day's notice for almost any reason or none at all. Consider the age of most domestic servants at the point they entered service. Many began work between 12 and 14 years old, sent into a household by parents who could not afford to feed an additional mouth at home, or who simply understood service as the only realistic path available to a daughter with no dowry and no formal education. A girl of 13, arriving at a strange house in an unfamiliar town, sometimes for the very first time in her life separated entirely from her family, was expected within days to learn an enormous body of skilled, physically demanding work under the near-total authority of adults she had known for less than a week. Wages for this labour were modest at best. A junior housemaid might earn a sum across an entire year that a middle-class family would spend on a single dinner party, and from that small amount she was frequently expected to purchase her own uniform, replace it as it wore, and set something aside, if she possibly could, against the day her position ended and she needed to survive the gap before finding another. Room and board were provided, which mattered enormously, but it also meant a servant's entire material existence, her bed, her meals, her very presence in a town or city, depended entirely on remaining employed by this one specific family. This dependency was not incidental to the system. It was, in many respects, the system's actual foundation. A servant with genuine financial independence, with savings enough to weather several months of unemployment, with family nearby who could take her in without difficulty, held considerably more freedom to speak plainly, to refuse unreasonable demands, to leave a cruel household without fear. Most servants had none of these things. They were, quite deliberately in some households, kept in a position where the loss of employment meant something close to genuine crisis, and that precariousness did more to enforce silence than any explicit threat ever could have. Romantic life for many female servants was restricted almost as tightly as every other part of their existence. Many households enforced strict rules against what was commonly called followers, meaning male suitors, forbidding female staff from receiving visitors of any romantic interest at all, on the household's reasoning that courtship distracted from duty, and, more bluntly, that an unmarried pregnancy among the staff created exactly the kind of scandal and disruption no household wished to manage. A housemaid discovered to be seeing a young man, even entirely respectably, could face dismissal for it alone, which meant relationships, where they existed, were conducted in secret, in stolen minutes on a half-day off, in letters passed carefully through trusted intermediaries, carrying precisely the same risk of discovery and precisely the same silence required to protect them as any of the family's own concealed affairs described earlier tonight. Marriage itself, for a woman in a live-in position, usually meant leaving service altogether, since almost no household employed a married housemaid living under its own roof, which turned every serious courtship into a genuine crossroads between love and livelihood. Isolation compounded the difficulty considerably. A servant working in a household far from her hometown, which was extremely common since families often specifically preferred to hire staff without strong local connections, had few people to turn to if a situation became genuinely unbearable. Letters home took days to arrive and days to answer, and a servant's half-day off, if she received one at all, offered barely enough time to travel any real distance and return before she was expected back at her post. Friendships formed with other servants in the same household, or occasionally with staff in neighbouring houses, but these relationships existed within the very same fragile, precarious system, offering emotional comfort more readily than any practical means of escape. It is worth pausing here to imagine, honestly and without romanticizing it, what it actually felt like to carry a household's private grief or crisis while having almost no standing to acknowledge that grief openly yourself. A nursery maid who had cared for a child since infancy, who had walked the floor with that child through countless nights of illness, who loved that child in every meaningful sense the word can hold, had no recognized claim on that relationship at all if the family chose, for whatever reason, to dismiss her. She might never see the child again. There was no visitation, no correspondence expected or even necessarily welcomed, simply an ending, sudden and complete, of a bond that had, for years, structured her entire daily life. The same applied in different form to the countless smaller griefs a servant absorbed simply by being present for a family's difficult moments without ever being permitted to grieve them openly herself. A lady's maid who sat through the night beside a dying mistress she had genuinely come to care for over years of shared intimacy was expected the following morning to resume her ordinary duties, to help arrange the funeral, to manage the practical business of mourning for a family whose loss she shared in every real sense except the socially recognized one. There was no space, in the formal structure of the household, for a servant's own bereavement to be acknowledged. She simply carried it alongside everything else. And it is precisely this emotional weight, carried silently and continuously, that makes the small number of servants who eventually did break, whether through blackmail, through simple exhaustion, or through the quiet accumulation of grievances that finally became too heavy to keep carrying, so much easier to understand with compassion rather than judgment. A person asked to absorb decades of intimate knowledge, genuine affection, real grief, and total social invisibility, all while remaining entirely dependent on the goodwill of the very people creating that burden, was being asked honestly for something close to superhuman endurance, that most managed it for entire working lives without ever once using what they knew for personal gain, says a great deal about the genuine character of the people who filled these positions. Some found ways to carry the weight that left room for real dignity within an unequal system. Long-serving housekeepers and butlers, particularly in households where the family treated them with something approaching genuine respect, often described their positions in whatever fragments of testimony survive with real pride rather than resentment. They understood themselves as skilled professionals, running complex operations with genuine competence, and took satisfaction in work well done, regardless of how the wider society chose to rank that work against other forms of labor. This pride was real, and it deserves to be taken seriously alongside everything else this story has described rather than dismissed as simple false consciousness imposed from above. Others found the arrangement considerably harder to bear and left evidence of that difficulty in whatever scraps of personal writing survived from the period: brief diary entries, letters to family, occasional testimony given in court proceedings unrelated to their own households. A recurring theme in these fragments is exhaustion, less the specific exhaustion of any single difficult day, and more a deeper, accumulated tiredness born of years spent managing other people's most private moments while having almost no one to manage her own. Loneliness, too, appears again and again, the particular loneliness of living inside a family's most intimate life while remaining permanently, structurally outside of it. Moral supervision extended well beyond romantic followers and into nearly every corner of a servant's supposedly private life. Church attendance, most households insisted, was not optional, and a servant who missed a Sunday service without good reason could expect pointed comment from the housekeeper, if not the mistress herself, since a household's staff were widely understood to reflect its own moral character to the watching neighborhood. Habits of drink, of language, of general demeanor were all considered fair territory for a mistress's judgment and correction, woven into the same character reference that governed a servant's employability, meaning a servant's entire private conduct, not merely her competence at her assigned duties, remained under a kind of continuous, quiet review for every single day she remained in a household's employ. Old age brought its own particular fear, one that shadowed even the most successful and best-treated servants throughout their working lives. There was, for almost the entire century, no pension scheme, no formal retirement provision, nothing resembling the safety net a modern worker might expect after decades of loyal service. A housekeeper or a butler who had served a single family faithfully for 30 or 40 years might, if that family was generous and the relationship had remained genuinely warm, be granted a small private allowance or a cottage on the estate to see out their remaining years. Many others were not so fortunate, and the spectre of the workhouse, the grim institutional last resort for the destitute poor, was never entirely absent from an aging servant's private calculations, however faithfully and however long they had served. This fear, quiet and rarely spoken aloud, did as much as any character reference to keep a servant compliant, careful, and silent for as many years as their body could manage the work at all. Younger servants carried a different, more immediate version of the same vulnerability. A child of 12 or 13 entering service for the first time had, in nearly every meaningful sense, no advocate at all inside the household. Complaints of unfair treatment, of excessive punishment, of genuine cruelty from a senior servant or a family member had almost nowhere to go. There was no formal channel for a scullery maid to report mistreatment that did not run directly through the very hierarchy she would be reporting against, and a child who tried anyway risked exactly the same consequence as an adult who spoke too freely: dismissal, no character, and a return home that her family, who had sent her into service in the first place precisely because they could not afford to keep her, was rarely in any position to absorb gracefully. It is worth asking, gently, what became of servants who simply could not continue, who left service not through dismissal, but through their own exhausted choice, walking away from the security of room and board and wages into an uncertain future that offered, for an unmarried woman with no other trade, remarkably few respectable alternatives. Some found work in the newer industries opening across the century, in shops, in the growing ranks of clerical work available to women by the century's final decades. Others returned to families who could barely support them. A smaller number, tragically, found no sustainable path forward at all and disappear from any surviving record entirely, leaving only the shape of their absence in a household's employment books, a name crossed off a wage ledger with no further explanation offered or required. This is, in the end, the quieter and more honest counterpart to the earlier story of blackmail letters and courtroom testimony. For every servant who eventually broke the silence in some dramatic, recorded way, there were thousands who carried an equally heavy private knowledge of a household's secrets for their entire working lives, and simply never spoke of it, not out of any particular heroism, but because the alternative, in almost every practical sense available to them, was worse. Their silence cost them something real, every single day, whether or not anyone above stairs ever paused to consider what that cost might actually be. Physical punishment, though formally discouraged in the more respectable household manuals of the period, persisted in less regulated forms in a good many households, particularly toward the youngest staff, who had essentially no recourse against a senior servant or family member inclined toward harshness. A cook known for a quick temper, or a mistress who considered a sharp slap an acceptable correction for a clumsy young housemaid, operated with almost no check on that behavior beyond her own conscience and, occasionally, the quiet disapproval of other staff who were themselves in no position to intervene meaningfully. The same silence that protected a family's secrets from the outside world also, in these cases, protected a household's own internal cruelties from ever being examined by anyone beyond its own walls. Consider, too, the particular loneliness of grief experienced entirely out of its proper social order. A servant who lost her own mother or father while in service, often at some distance, frequently could not attend the funeral at all, since a half-day's leave, even where it was granted without difficulty, rarely allowed enough time to travel any real distance and return before she was expected back at her post, and a longer absence risked her position entirely. She grieved in these cases in stolen minutes between duties, in a shared attic room after the candle had been blown out, while the household around her continued its ordinary rhythm entirely undisturbed by a loss that, for her, was reshaping everything. Perhaps tonight, that is worth remembering above almost everything else this house has to offer. Not the scandal, and not the rare dramatic collapse into blackmail or exposure, but the far more common, far quieter endurance of people who carried an entire family's private truth for years, sometimes for a lifetime, and asked in return for very little beyond a fair wage, a decent character when the time finally came to leave, and the small, ordinary dignity of being seen occasionally as something more than furniture that happened to move on its own. And yet, for all of this, it would be a mistake to end on a note of pure hardship, since that would flatten these lives just as thoroughly as the fictional versions this evening has already gently critiqued, only in the opposite direction. Servants of the period also laughed genuinely and often over shared jokes in the servants' hall, over the particular absurdities of a demanding mistress or a clumsy new hallboy, over small private triumphs, a difficult stain finally lifted, a complicated dinner served without incident, a rare half-day spent exactly as they pleased. Endurance and genuine, ordinary happiness were never mutually exclusive in these households, any more than they are anywhere else. The two simply coexisted, day after day, the way they tend to in most real, complicated human lives. The fire in the servants' hall has burned down to embers now. Somewhere above, the family sleeps, entirely unaware of how much has just been said, quietly, in the dark, on their behalf, and about them both at once. Almost everything most people picture when they imagine a Victorian household's secrets arrived through fiction rather than through the historical record itself, and it is worth spending a little time here separating the two gently before we let the house settle any further into sleep. Stories about servants who knew too much have proven remarkably durable across more than a century of storytelling, and the reasons for that durability say almost as much about us, the audience, returning to these stories again and again, as they do about the Victorians who actually lived the reality behind them. The most famous fictional housekeeper in the English-speaking imagination almost certainly remains the formidable figure who runs a great house with total, unsettling authority in a widely read early 20th century novel, a character whose devotion to a household's previous mistress curdles across the story into something closer to obsession than loyalty. She is not, strictly speaking, a Victorian character, since the novel that made her famous was written well after the Victorian era had ended. But she draws directly on the same 19th century tradition. This story has spent the evening describing the housekeeper as keeper of a household's deepest, most carefully guarded truths. What that novel captures with real psychological accuracy is the sheer intensity of feeling a long-serving housekeeper could develop toward the family, and particularly toward specific individuals within the family she had spent years serving. What it exaggerates, understandably, for the purposes of Gothic drama, is the idea that this intensity would express itself through active, calculated menace. The historical record suggests something quieter and, in its own way, considerably sadder. Housekeepers whose devotion produced not sinister plotting, but simply decades of unacknowledged emotional labor, invisible even to the very families who depended on it most. Television, in the latter half of the 20th century, offered a gentler, warmer counter-vision of the same world, a long-running series depicting a wealthy London household and the staff who ran it, following both families across decades of change with genuine affection for characters on both sides of the green baize door. This version of service, with its dignified butler, its formidable cook, its ladies' maids and footmen each given real inner lives and real loyalty to the family they served, has shaped popular imagination of Victorian and Edwardian domestic life more thoroughly than almost any other single work of fiction, and its influence continued directly into the even more widely watched country house drama that followed decades later. These warmer depictions get a great deal genuinely right. The rhythms of the working day, the precise hierarchy below stairs, the real affection that could develop between long-serving staff and the families they worked for across genuine decades of shared life. Where they tend to soften the historical reality is in exactly the area this story has spent the most time exploring tonight. The sheer precariousness of a servant's position, the total dependency on a single character reference, the genuine desperation that occasionally, rarely, but genuinely, pushed real servants toward blackmail or simply toward walking away from service altogether with nowhere secure to go. Fiction, by its nature, needs its servant characters to matter to the story being told, and the easiest way to make a character matter is to give them warmth, wit, and a clearly defined relationship with the family around them. The historical reality of Victorian service included plenty of genuine warmth, that much is entirely true and worth holding on to, but it also included enormous numbers of servants who passed through a household's life largely unremarked, whose names went unrecorded in any surviving letter or diary, whose entire working life left no trace beyond a line in a wage ledger and, if they were fortunate, a single short character reference written when they finally moved on. This is where the surviving personal writing of actual Victorian servants becomes so valuable and so rare. One of the very few servants whose own words survive in real depth was a woman who spent years in domestic service in the middle decades of the century and kept a diary describing her daily life and duties with unusual, sometimes startling candor. Her writing offers something fiction, however well researched, simply cannot, the actual interior voice of someone living the reality this whole story has been describing from the outside, her exhaustion, her pride in physical competence, her complicated feelings about her own position within a household, recorded in her own words rather than reconstructed by a novelist working from archival research generations later. The Victorians themselves, it is worth remembering, were already telling sensationalized versions of this exact story to each other while it was still happening. The sensation novel, a wildly popular genre through the 1860s and beyond, frequently featured scheming servants, hidden identities, and household secrets threatening to spill into public scandal, feeding a reading public that clearly found something irresistible in the idea of a respectable home concealing a dangerous truth just behind its green baize door. These novels almost certainly exaggerated how often real blackmail and real scheming actually occurred below stairs, but their enormous popularity tells us something true all the same, that Victorian readers themselves understood, even if only half-consciously, exactly how much power their own household staff genuinely held over them, and found that knowledge thrilling precisely because it touched a real and private anxiety. The newspaper coverage of actual court cases involving servants worked in a similar direction, disproportionate attention paid to a small number of genuinely rare incidents, reported with just enough moralizing detail to reinforce for every household reading the account over breakfast exactly why absolute discretion needed to be demanded of their own staff without exception. A single, well-publicized case of a blackmailing footman likely did more to tighten household rules about servant conduct across an entire county than 1,000 quiet, uneventful years of loyal service ever could, simply because fear travels faster and further than reassurance ever does. Reading writing like this against the more polished fictional accounts is genuinely instructive. The real diary contains far less drama and far more repetition than any novel would tolerate. The same duties performed day after day, the same small frustrations recurring, the same quiet satisfactions taken in work done well. It also contains, threaded through the ordinary record of daily labour, exactly the kind of intimate physical detail this story explored earlier tonight. The closeness of dressing and undressing, the particular vulnerability of caring for another person's body as a matter of routine employment. There is very little plotting in it, very little scheming. Mostly, there is simply endurance, recorded with remarkable clarity by someone who never expected her private words to be read by anyone at all. Beneath even the respectable newspapers, a cheaper, more sensational press sold accounts of notorious crimes, including the occasional servant blackmail or theft case, to a working-class readership hungry for exactly this kind of drama, printed quickly, sold on street corners, illustrated with crude woodcuts, and often taking considerably greater liberties with the actual facts than any respectable paper would allow itself. These cheap broadsheets and pamphlets tell us less about what actually happened in any specific household and rather more about how widely, across every level of Victorian society, the idea of the servant who knew too much had already captured the public imagination, long before any novelist or later television writer thought to build a story around it. The fascination this evening has been exploring was never confined to any single class of reader. Everyone, it seems, understood on some level exactly how much power quietly sat behind that green baize door. Court records offer a different, equally valuable counterpoint to fiction's version of events. Where novels and television tend to build toward a single dramatic revelation, a servant unmasked, a secret finally exposed in a moment of high tension, the actual legal record of servant blackmail cases reads far more mundanely and far more painfully. Letters requesting modest sums of money, phrased with a strange, careful mixture of desperation and formality. Testimony describing years of underpaid, precarious work leading up to a single, poorly considered decision that then ended in prosecution and years of hard labour. There is little of the Gothic menace fiction tends to supply. There is instead a great deal of very ordinary human desperation, meeting a legal system with very little sympathy to offer it. It is worth pausing, too, on a question these dramatised versions rarely ask directly, though this whole evening has circled it repeatedly. Whose story is a household secret actually telling? Fiction almost always answers this question in favour of the family, the mistress's affair, the master's debts, the ancestral scandal finally uncovered, with the servant functioning primarily as the mechanism by which that family story reaches its resolution. The historical record, fragmentary as it is, suggests the servant's own story, her exhaustion, her calculations, her rare and desperate departures from a lifetime of careful silence, deserves at least as much attention as the family drama her knowledge happened to orbit, even though almost none of the popular fiction built from this world has ever quite been willing to centre her that completely. There is also a case to be made that our continued fascination with this world says something about our own moment, not just about the Victorians. Modern life offers very few equivalents to the total live-in intimacy this evening has described, and perhaps that absence is part of why the image continues to hold such a grip on the imagination. The idea of someone who truly knows a household from the inside, who has seen behind every closed door, has come to feel almost impossibly rare in a world where most of us now guard our privacy far more completely, and where very few people outside our closest relationships ever see us quite that unguarded, quite that often, for quite that long. It is also worth noting how selectively even the more sympathetic fictional portraits tend to choose their subjects. Popular imagination gravitates overwhelmingly toward the senior staff of grand country houses, the butler, the head housekeeper, the favoured lady's maid, roles carrying real status and, relatively speaking, real comfort within the hierarchy this evening has described. Far less attention, in fiction or in popular memory generally, goes to the scullery maid, the hallboy, the lowest and youngest members of any household staff, whose lives were considerably harder, considerably more anonymous, and considerably less likely to be remembered by anyone at all, fictional or otherwise. The story of Victorian service that has survived into popular culture is, in this sense, already a somewhat privileged and partial one, even within a group of people who held very little privilege to begin with. More recent decades of storytelling have begun, gradually, to shift the center of gravity in exactly this kind of tale, imagining a household story from below stairs outward, rather than treating the servants as background figures orbiting a family who remain the real subject throughout. This is, in its own way, a genuinely useful corrective, even when the specific plots it produces remain, understandably, works of imagination rather than documented history. It reflects a growing recognition among writers and audiences alike of exactly the argument this evening has tried to build slowly and carefully across every chapter so far, that the people running the second house were never merely supporting characters in someone else's drama. They were, in every meaningful sense, living the central drama of their own lives, one that simply happened to unfold within someone else's house. None of this is meant to diminish the genuine pleasure of the fictional versions, which have, after all, kept this entire chapter of history alive in the popular imagination for well over a century, when it might otherwise have been forgotten almost entirely outside academic archives. A story needs shape and drama and characters whose motivations resolve into something an audience can follow and feel. Fiction has given the Victorian servant a kind of afterlife, a continued presence in our collective imagination that the historical record alone, scattered across wage ledgers and court transcripts and the rare surviving diary, could never quite have managed on its own. But it is worth remembering gently, as this hour continues to unwind toward its own quiet ending, that the real people behind these stories lived lives considerably less tidy than any of their fictional descendants. They did not, for the most part, harbour secret obsessions or plot dramatic revenges. They woke in the cold, laid fires no one saw them lay, carried letters they never opened, dressed bodies both living and dead, and carried, silently for years at a stretch, more knowledge about the families around them than those families ever fully appreciated or perhaps ever wanted to. Academic historians working from the middle of the 20th century onward brought their own considerable and rather different contribution to recovering this world, sifting through parish records, census returns, and household account books with a patience no novelist or television researcher would ever need to match, reconstructing the statistical shape of domestic service. How many servants a typical household of a given income actually kept, how wages shifted across the decades, how the average length of a single position tended to run, even where the individual human voices behind those numbers remain frustratingly silent. This quieter, more painstaking work rarely produces the vivid, emotionally satisfying detail that fiction offers so readily, but it supplies something fiction cannot, a genuine, evidence-based sense of just how widespread and how structurally consistent this entire world of enforced discretion actually was across hundreds of thousands of households, rather than the single fictional house any one novel or drama can ever really show us. The real housekeeper was rarely as sinister as her most famous fictional counterpart, and rarely as consistently warm and wise as her most beloved television versions either. She was, more often, simply a working woman managing an enormous amount of responsibility with very little formal power, doing her genuine best within a system that offered her almost no protection, and asked in exchange for her complete and permanent discretion about everything she came to know. That is not perhaps as dramatically satisfying a story as the ones we have told about her since, but it may be, in its own quiet way, considerably more worth remembering. The fiction gave the Victorian servant a voice, a personality, a place in our imagination. The historical record, sparse as it is, gives us something else instead, a genuine, careful glimpse of what that life actually felt like from the inside, told in fragments, and worth listening to precisely because it asks for nothing dramatic from us in return, only perhaps our attention for a little while before sleep finally takes hold. The role that survived longest in somewhat altered form was the daily cleaner or charwoman, a servant who came into a household for set hours during the day and returned to her own home, her own family, and her own life each evening, rather than living permanently under the family's roof as the Victorian model had always required. This shift from living in to living out service marked, in a very real sense, the true end of the second house as this story has described it all evening. A charwoman arriving each morning and departing each afternoon simply did not accumulate the same total, continuous, intimate knowledge of a family's private life that a live-in housekeeper of 30 years' standing once had. She saw the house. She rarely, in the same way, came to know its entire soul. The world that built the second house did not end all at once. It wore away slowly across decades, the way a riverbank wears away, imperceptible from one day to the next, and yet, looked at across enough time, completely transformed. By the final years of the 19th century, the system was already showing quiet strain. Young women who might once have entered service almost automatically now had other options opening to them. Work in shops, in the expanding ranks of clerical and typing positions, in the new department stores springing up in every sizable town, offering shorter hours, greater independence, and none of the total, all-consuming dependency that domestic service had always required. The First World War, arriving early in the following century, accelerated a change that had already begun. Men who had worked as footmen and hall boys left for military service in enormous numbers, many never to return to household work at all. Women who had once seemed to have few alternatives to service found themselves, almost overnight, working in factories, in offices, in roles that paid better and asked considerably less of their private lives in exchange. When the war ended, a great many simply did not go back. Households that had once employed a dozen or more staff found themselves managing with 3 or 2 or 1, and the great second house that had run silently behind so many Victorian walls began quite rapidly to empty out. Something quieter than legal reform actually did more over time to loosen the old dependency than any single law. The sheer growth of alternative employment for working-class women, first in factories and later in shops, offices, and eventually a widening range of professions, meant that domestic service gradually stopped being, as it had been for so much of the Victorian century, the default and near-universal option for a young woman with limited means. Choice, even modest and imperfect choice, changed the underlying power balance between servant and household more completely than any single piece of legislation managed to. A servant who could genuinely walk away and find other work held real leverage her Victorian counterpart, facing service or genuine destitution as her only two options, essentially never had. This decline mattered enormously for the particular story this evening has been telling because it changed, fundamentally, the calculation of dependency that had made servant silence so reliable for so long. A young woman in the 1920s who found her position in a household intolerable, or who simply grew tired of the endless hours and the total absence of privacy, could genuinely leave and find other respectable work elsewhere, in a way her Victorian grandmother, entering service at 13 with no alternative in sight, essentially could not. The character reference, that single sheet of paper that had once held total power over a person's future, gradually lost its absolute grip, simply because service was no longer the only door available. And as the system loosened, so too, gradually, did the silence it had enforced. The interwar decades produced the first genuine wave of published memoirs by former domestic servants, written by women, now older, now settled into other lives, who had once worked below stairs in the great houses of the previous century and its immediate aftermath, and who were, for the first time in any meaningful published sense, willing and able to describe that world from the inside. These accounts, arriving decades after the events they described, offered readers something the Victorian era itself had almost never permitted: the servant's own account of what it had actually felt like, told without the immediate professional risk that would once have made such honesty impossible. Reading these later accounts, alongside the sparse Victorian evidence we explored earlier tonight, is genuinely illuminating. The anger is more visible in the later memoirs, the exhaustion named more plainly, the resentment toward employers who had taken decades of devoted service for granted, acknowledged openly, in a way no Victorian servant, dependent on an ongoing character reference, could ever have safely allowed herself. And yet the affection is there too, sometimes surprisingly strong. Memories of particular families treated with genuine warmth, even across the gulf of decades and enormous social change. The relationship between servant and served, it turns out, was rarely simple in either direction, not fondly sentimental and not purely exploitative, but something more complicated, carrying real elements of both. What became, then, of the specific secrets this evening has spent so long exploring, the affairs known only to a lady's maid, the debts understood only by a butler managing a dwindling wine cellar, the pregnancies and confinements and quiet family crises witnessed by servants sworn, in every practical sense, to permanent silence. The overwhelming majority simply died with the people who held them. A housekeeper who served a single family for 30 years and never once spoke of what she had witnessed there took that knowledge, in the end, to her own grave, exactly as the system had always required of her, and exactly as she had, in most cases, fully intended. This is worth sitting with for a long moment because it means something genuinely irretrievable happened across those decades, an enormous body of intimate, first-hand knowledge about how Victorian families actually lived, quarreled, grieved, and concealed themselves from the world, simply vanished, unrecorded, carried quietly out of existence by people whose entire professional identity had depended on making sure it never surfaced at all. Historians studying the Victorian family today work in large part with what the families themselves chose to preserve: careful letters, edited diaries, official portraits of domestic life, precisely because the people who actually knew the fuller, messier truth were trained across an entire century to leave almost no trace of it behind. The male side of domestic service contracted even more sharply than the female side across these decades, and for reasons worth naming plainly. The particular role of the valet, personal, exacting, requiring a master wealthy enough to maintain an entire wardrobe and social calendar, elaborate enough to need daily managing, simply became rarer as the century turned, as fashion simplified, and as fewer households could justify or afford staff dedicated so completely to a single person's personal presentation. Footmen persisted rather longer, particularly in the very grandest households, but their numbers too thinned steadily, and the great uniformed matched pairs standing at doorways across fashionable streets became, within a few decades, a rarity rather than an ordinary sight. In the later 20th century, as the last generation who had actually worked in service as young people grew genuinely elderly, a number of social historians and oral history projects made a deliberate, sustained effort to record their memories before they were lost entirely, sitting with former housemaids and footmen and kitchen staff by then in their 70s and 80s and asking them, often for the very first time in their lives, to describe what the work had actually been like from the inside. These recordings, held today in various regional archives and museum collections, represent one of the last genuine opportunities historians had to capture this world directly from people who had lived it, rather than reconstructing it entirely from the household's own careful records, and they arrived, in most cases, only just in time. A small number of fragments escaped this near-total erasure, and it is worth naming gently what allowed them to survive at all. Court records, because legal proceedings required certain truths to be stated plainly and preserved formally, regardless of how inconvenient they were to the families involved. The rare personal diary, kept in genuine secrecy and preserved sometimes by pure accident, long after its author's death. Occasional late-life memoirs, written once the old dependency had finally loosened enough to make honesty survivable. And oral history projects undertaken in the 20th century's later decades when researchers began deliberately seeking out the last living former servants, elderly by then, and recording their memories before those memories too were lost entirely. These fragments do not add up to anything like a complete picture. They are more like the handful of stars visible on a genuinely cloudy night, enough to confirm that an entire sky exists beyond what we can currently see, without ever letting us map it fully. What they do offer, taken together, is confirmation of everything this evening has gently suggested through inference and pattern, rather than exhaustive documentary proof, that the servants of Victorian households really did occupy an extraordinary position of intimate knowledge, that this knowledge really was protected by an unusually effective and largely unwritten system of silence, and that the rare moments when that silence broke reveal, more clearly than almost any other surviving evidence, just how much these ordinary working people actually understood about the families whose lives they spent their own lives quietly sustaining. It is tempting and perhaps understandable to wish for more, to want the full, unfiltered testimony of every housekeeper and lady's maid and footman who ever kept a Victorian family's secrets, laid out plainly for us to finally read in complete detail. But there is something worth honouring too in the incompleteness itself. These people were never obligated to hand their knowledge over to history any more than they were obligated to hand it over to the gossip of their own era. Their silence, chosen or enforced, remains, in its own way, the last thing genuinely theirs to keep, a private inheritance passed down to no one, ending quietly with each individual life that held it. There is a particular kind of respect owed to a silence that was never once broken, even when no one was left alive who could have benefited from breaking it. A housekeeper who died in her 80s, decades after the family she once served had themselves all passed away, and who never once, across her entire long retirement, spoke of what she had witnessed in that house, kept a promise that had by then stopped protecting anyone at all in any practical sense. She kept it anyway. That kind of quiet, unrewarded fidelity to a private code held long after any possible consequence for breaking it had disappeared deserves to be recognized as something close to genuine integrity, whatever else we might think of the unequal system that first demanded it of her. There is something quietly striking, if you let yourself notice it, in the fact that visitors today can walk freely through servants' corridors that the family who once owned the house would rarely, if ever, have entered themselves, corridors built, quite deliberately, to keep the two worlds of that household apart. A modern visitor with a museum ticket now has more casual access to the physical space of the second house than most Victorian mistresses ever chose to claim for themselves, even as the deeper knowledge that space once held, the actual secrets, the actual names, the actual weight of everything witnessed there, remains permanently, irretrievably out of reach. No ticket or guidebook able to restore what discretion so thoroughly and so successfully erased. The great houses themselves mostly still stand, many of them now museums or hotels or divided into flats, their servants' corridors sometimes preserved as curiosities for visitors to walk through, admiring the ingenuity of a vanished domestic world without ever quite feeling, in any real sense, the cold of those unheated attic bedrooms, or the ache of a 16-hour working day. The green baize door survives in some of these houses too, painted, patched, occasionally still hanging on its original hinges, a small, quiet monument to an entire century's worth of information that passed silently through it, in one direction only, and almost never came back out again. What remains, in the end, is not really a single story at all, but a pattern repeated across hundreds of thousands of households in country manors and modest townhouses alike, wherever a family employed even a single servant to help run its private life. The pattern holds steady wherever you look closely enough to find it. Intimate knowledge granted almost entirely without consent, flowing in one direction only. A silence maintained not chiefly through affection, though affection certainly existed, but through the far more powerful mechanism of economic necessity, and beneath it all, an entire century's worth of witnesses who saw everything, said almost nothing, and left, when their working lives finally ended, remarkably little trace of what they had actually known. And somewhere, in the gap between what actually happened in these houses and what we can now ever fully know about it, there remains a kind of respect worth extending gently to everyone who lived and worked inside that second house, the hidden one, behind the felt-covered door. They were not simply background figures in someone else's story, however completely the historical record sometimes treats them that way. They were witnesses to an entire century of private human life, trusted with almost everything, credited with almost nothing, and asked, in the end, to carry what they knew quietly into whatever came after, which most of them, by every honest measure available to us now, actually did. The house is fully quiet now. Somewhere above, the family sleeps on as they always have, in rooms kept warm and clean by hands they rarely thought to notice. And somewhere below, in the last hour before dawn arrives and the whole long day begins again, the second house rests too for just a little while, holding everything it has ever known and saying, as always, absolutely nothing at all. Let the corridor go dark now. Let the candle by the back stair burn itself down to nothing, and let the last footstep on the servant's stair settle into stillness. There is nowhere left to carry anything tonight, no fire waiting to be laid before dawn, no letter waiting to be sorted, no door you need to stand quietly beside, waiting for someone else to pass. Feel the weight of the day, whatever it held for you, settle the way ash settles at the bottom of a grate once the flame has finally gone out. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Not the names, not the secrets, not even the shape of the house itself. Let it all go soft at the edges, the way a room goes soft when your eyes are almost closed. Somewhere far above you now, imagine a single window, dark, and beyond it, a sky just beginning to lighten at its very furthest edge, hours still before anyone needs to wake. You are not needed there, not yet. For now, there is only the quiet and the low, steady warmth of embers and the sense of a house finally fully at rest around you. Breathe in slowly. Let your shoulders sink further than they already have. Breathe out and let go of whatever small tension is still sitting somewhere behind your eyes. The second house is asleep, the first house is asleep, and whatever it carried tonight, it will still be carrying gently, quietly, without you, until you're ready to think about any of it again. If a single image is still drifting somewhere behind your eyes, let it be this one, small and unremarkable. A hand, cracked from cold water, resting for just a moment on a banister at the very top of the back stairs. Nothing more happening than that. No secret being carried in that moment, no burden, no knowledge, just a person, tired, finally still, at the very end of a very long day. Let that stillness be the last thing you carry with you now. Before you drift the rest of the way, this story, and every other one we've told, also lives as a full audiobook over on Spotify, so if you ever want to fall asleep to one of these again without reaching for anything at all, the link is always there in the description or the pinned comment, waiting for you. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one. And if you're still awake enough to wonder, before sleep finally takes you, I'd love to know, what's the one secret you think a servant like this carried the longest, the one that never made it into any letter or any diary or any court record at all? Let me know in the comments whenever you wake. For now, sleep well.